Hello, and welcome to this episode of Strange as It Seems, a podcast about history, occultism, espionage, secret societies, mystery, conspiracy, and weirdness high and low. The common denominator is that the topics all embody the strange, that is, something that's unusual or surprising in a way that's unsettling or hard to understand. The aim is to reveal and discuss, but without any definite expectation of explaining or proving anything. Because, more often than not, the closer you look at the strange, the stranger it gets. Okay, so here we are, Stephen, for another episode of Strange as It Seems. I think this is number 16. So, again, I'm going to start out before we get into today. Well, you've seen the thumbnail. You kind of know what we're going to be talking about. So, hold that thought for a minute while I make the usual pitch about liking and subscribing, pressing all the buttons. If you like it, if you don't, just go away. That's the simplest thing to do. Go somewhere else. YouTube has an infinite number of things to interest you, or wherever you're listening to this. But if you do enjoy what you're listening to and would like to hear more of the same, please like and subscribe. I think as of today, we're on the cusp of 700 on YouTube, and it would be so gratifying to get beyond that number, and then perhaps going on to 1,000. Who knows? Again, we're trying to play the game, so we have done that. So the pitch now ends. So what are we talking about today? Well, we're going to get into things. Secret societies of the elite secret groups, or elite societies, because some of them, I'll argue, aren't necessarily secret societies. They are elite, however. And Bohemian Grove, Bilderbergers, and beyond. And we will certainly go beyond those two. We'll look at things like, I think Skull and Bones will probably come in for a mention. The Cambridge Apostles. Certainly Cecil Rhodes' Society of the Elect, because you can't talk about elite secret societies without that one. And we might round things off with the Freemasonic Order of the Golden Centurion. What the hell is that, you may be asking? Well, wait around and we'll get there. So what I want to do is to look at some of the better known and some of the lesser known so-called elite secret societies and look at these groups of all, like the Illuminati that we talked about in a previous episode. The term in some way has almost become generic for any kind of secretive group. And every group we're going to be talking about in here, someone, I guarantee you, has connected them to the Illuminati. Because what can't you connect to the Illuminati? Remember, to sort of recap the gist of that episode, I would suppose, is that there was a real Illuminati. It did have a plan for world control. It visibly faded out of official existence after about a decade, but never really disappeared. So what became of it? Who knows? And therefore, it can be everywhere. It can be nowhere. It can be everything. It can be nothing. That's the mystery of the Illuminati. So let's look at some other groups that are fairly well known. And I guess one of the ways to start with them is what most people think of as Bohemian Grove. If you hear this group mentioned, it's always mentioned as Bohemian Grove. So right off the bat, I want to make this distinction very clear. There is no such group or society as Bohemian Grove. There is the Bohemian Club. The Bohemian Club is the organization. Bohemian Grove is where they have their summer camp. That is a place. It's not the organization itself. But it's kind of interesting to note how in popular culture, the place where the Bohemian Club meets for 3 weeks out of the year, it exists 52 weeks out of the year, but where it holds its, in some ways, semi-visible public gatherings, And by semi-visible, it means people know they're there. Guys like Alex Jones sneak in and take movies. It's not all that hidden away. That has become the group itself. So maybe one thing might start with here is a kind of description of what, if people mention Bohemian Grove, Bohemian Club, what will most come to mind? And the description is essentially that, the sun is setting behind the redwoods, and there's a group of elaborately robed men gathered around the base of a 40-foot, roughly, because I'm not sure anybody has measured it, it's big, stone owl. Across a small lake, hundreds of other robed figures look on. And in fact, nearby, next to the lake, there are other robed musicians that are providing the musical accompaniment for this. This whole thing has an orchestra backing it up. Oh, and by the way, the people in the orchestra are not members of the group. They're outside musicians who have been brought in for this purpose, which also shows you again that this isn't entirely secret. There are all kinds of caterers that come in and out. There is the orchestra that's brought in or out. Allegedly, and I emphasize allegedly, there are whole busloads of hookers that are brought in or out. Because just to get this off right clear to begin with, the Bohemian Club is a boys' club. There are no female members. Never have been. There may be at some point, but certainly not now. So it's secret, but it's not that secret. So the ceremonial party of robed men places a human-shaped wicker effigy on an altar in front of the owl. And they mess around trying to set the effigy on fire. But they have some trouble. And then a voice booms from the owl because it's wired for sound. And it instructs them to use the lamp of fellowship. Apparently they were trying to start it with just fire. And they do as commanded, and the wicker figure just bursts into flame and burns merrily at the foot of the owl as they get back on their little boat and go back across the lake. And chanting and music fill the air, and the ceremony then ends with a display of fireworks. And so the assembled members of the Bohemian Club, about 2,000 of them generally, kick off, inaugurate, the annual 3-week summer retreat at their private woodland playground, Bohemian Grove.
3 weeks?
3 weeks. 3 weeks of fun.
Wow. That was like 2 days.
Oh, no. I mean, if you're going to get all these guys in the woods, you got to have more than 2 days. You couldn't even get a busload of hookers in 2 days. I mean, the ritual is called the cremation of care, and the effigy is called dull care. So, it doesn't take much imagination to see the ritual as a mock human sacrifice. Well, that's what it is. It's a mock human sacrifice. And critics of the Bohemian Club allege that it's a thinly disguised pagan cult masquerading as an exclusive men's club. Alex Jones, for instance, claims that it's a survival of an ancient Canaanite, Luciferian, Babylonian mystery religion. That's kind of combining 3 things together that don't quite fit historically, but, it sounds good. Rolls off the tongue. Canaanite, Luciferian, Babylonian mystery religion. Specifically, the ancient cult of Moloch, a deity to which children were burned as sacrifices. Other people see it as a sinister manifestation of druidic rites or a secret owl society. That sounds kind of scary. Linked to the what? Illuminati. Still others detect the odor of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. Mm-hmm. A Bohemian brother would insist that the ceremony, like the club, is just for fun. Nobody is gathering in the woods to worship Moloch. They just want to kick back and enjoy some, what they like to term, hijinks. See, officially, in the terminology of the club, that's what you do when you go to Bohemian Grove for summer camp. You engage in hijinks. This is all fun and games. Now, it's a rich boys club. That is one version of it. Another as a Canaanite, Luciferian, Babylonian mystery religion murder cult. Well, that's something else. Who says it can't be both? Now, the point in this is that there's a lot of Well, there's a lot of mythology, or what I like to call barnacles, that attach themselves to things. It's just like a ship out in the ocean, floating along. And as time goes on, it gets more and more crap that attaches itself to it. Life forms begin to use it as a base of operation. And the same thing happens historically to groups like the Illuminati or even the Bohemian Club, is that anytime we don't know the answers to something, we don't know exactly, the whole question, there's a bunch of rich guys, and that's one of the things they have in common. They are almost generally wealthy. They are elite members of society. We'll try to define that term a little better as we go on to further. They're doing stuff that looks from the outside to be weird. Okay, I mean, robes are kind of weird. A 40-foot stone owl is weird. I mean, that's the question that I've been asked in other interviews. Is like, what's with the robes and the owl? I mean, can't you just go out? I and many of you have probably gone to summer camps, and there have been things like that before. You probably got together and sang songs and gathered in groups, but was there ever a 40-foot stone talking owl involved? Not in any summer camp I went to. Nor were there robes, nor was there musical accompaniment for a bust-in orchestra. So this all good. Maybe this is simply what rich people could afford at their summer camps, but when there is some kind of mystery that we can't explain, we have to come up with an explanation. People don't like things to be unexplained. And in some cases, those explanations can be quite correct. In other cases, they can just be kind of spitballing it. So here you've got a bunch of rich guys in the woods doing weird things. What kind of possible reasons could there be for this? So, what I want to try to do today is not to justify the existence of the Bohemian Club, because really I can't answer the question as why the robes and why the owl, other than the fact that it's all part of the theatrical element which involved in this. They're putting on a kind of play. The question, as with all of these things, always comes down to intent. What is your intention in doing this? Is your intention simply to have fun, or is your intention to invoke the spirit of Moloch? Well, so where did all of this begin? Let's go back and try to look at the historical facts as best as we can put them together. So, the Bohemian Club, before there was a Bohemian Grove, came into existence in San Francisco, California in 1872. In fact, not only can we pinpoint the year it came into existence, we can pinpoint the exact place. And that was the offices, in fact, the reporter's staff room at the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper. So it was begun by newspapermen. And that arguably, one version is that's where the name comes from, because there was, think about it, in the 19th century at least, and to some extent still today, one of the things about newspapermen, reporters, is that they went from one paper to another. They were regularly jumping ship. And since they were itinerant, since they often moved around, that was then attached to the term Bohemian, which in the 19th century was a polite term for gypsy, which meant people who traveled around. So these were sort of gypsy journalists. They were Bohemians, and that it's perfectly plausible as to where the term comes from. I think there may be some other things added into that, but Bohemian was a term for an itinerant journalist, and it was essentially reporters, journalists who formed the club at a newspaper in 1872. Now, other people were invited to join, and initially the main core, the regular members, were journalists. But they also, they had friends, and their friends were mostly people in the arts, musicians, artists, some craftsmen who were involved. The kind of people that
That's what I think about when I hear
The
Bohemian.
journalists, who do journalists hang out other than journalists at bars? Well, very often they're actors. This was another actors were a part of this. So if you think about it, not exactly the elite of society. I mean, there's a very clear kind of social class element to this, but these weren't people who were wealthy. Right. Most journalists weren't terribly rich, and neither were, well, certainly not artists, painters, in rare cases, or actors, most of them for that matter. So this was not initially an elite secret society. It was a secret society that tended to draw people from the kind of literary classes or artistic classes in society. But here's what happened. It became the cool club to belong to. The Bohemian Club was a kind of cool group. I mean, look, it's like a picnic party going on. So
it's kind of the norm with artists.
People who don't feel that they're cool want to be part of the cool. They want to hang out with the cool kids. And I guess maybe that was it. The reporters, the hard drinking, hard smoking, murder reporters, the artists, okay, the ones that got to, paint naked people, all of those are the cool kids. And who wants to be cool? Well, businessmen, because business generally it's more lucrative than any of those things. That's where the money was. And that's why businessmen began to be invited to become members, because they could pay for things. And what's one of the things that they could pay for? Well, they could pay for a 2,700 acre grove of pristine redwoods 60 miles north of San Francisco. That is Bohemian Grove.
Is there a record of, did this start basically as like a drinking club at some bar and then it moved to, hey, we bought some land?
Well, initially they seemed to meet at the Chronicle offices. But then eventually so there is still, to this day, if you're in San Francisco, go to 620 Taylor Street. It's right on or near the corner, I think, of Post and Taylor. And that is the clubhouse, the headquarters of the Bohemian Club. There is a plaque on the building.
To this day?
It says, to this day.
Wow.
So it may have moved, but today it is at 624 Taylor Street. And it says Bohemian Club. You can walk in. If you don't have any business, they'll probably tell you to leave. They have a phone number you can call. Okay, it's an actual place. And you'll see the emblem of the club there next to the door, which is an owl. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. The emblem, the kind of totem animal of the Bohemian Club is an owl. Hence the 40-foot owl that you'll later find at Bohemian Grove. But I think it's around. So the club was formed in 1872, and I think it's 1879, maybe early 1880s, that one of the rich new members, or a group of them, get together and buy their summer playground. And this is so, why do you want to do that? Well, you can get out of town. Because, I mean, you can't really do this in downtown San Francisco, can you? I mean, that would be, you get your clubhouse, but you can't really put a 40-foot stone owl in there. And it's difficult to hold large, robed, pseudo-pagan human sacrifice rituals.
This is in Northern California?
That's in Northern California.
So
it's near Monte Rio, right up on the Russian River.
Is it cooler? I mean, I imagine a lot of these can...
that's one argument. They're going out there because it's cooler in the redwoods. It's generally pretty cool at San Francisco. I mean,
that's true.
The weather tends to be... if you think of California as always being sunny, no, that's L.A. That's not the Bay Area. That's not San Francisco. I mean, the whole state can be clear and baking, and fog can exist right over that area. So it's a way of escaping the San Francisco fog. Mostly it was just a way of having more room to spread out and to hold your, Babylonian Moloch rituals or whatever it is you're going to do. You want to, and without a lot of prying eyes. So you did eventually want to have privacy. So as time goes on, even by the beginning of the 20th century, let's say 30 years down the road, journalists and artists are still members of it. In fact, they never really disappear from the club rosters. You can find them today. But they become greatly outnumbered by CEOs, businessmen, and politicians. Because what the club becomes is increasingly becomes a system of social networking. This is where, in an informal environment, you can go and meet people with common interests and be part of the cool kids club. Now that, in a way, goes against the club's whole motto. And again, they had a motto, and still do, which is weaving spiders come not here. So what exactly does that mean? Well, the official explanation is that it means that, look, the whole point about the club, I'll argue, is just to get men who have otherwise carry a great deal of responsibility and pressure in their lifetimes, a place where they can relax around their friends or like-minded comrades, and they can do this, and they can just kind of have fun. It's really sort of trying to recapture your youth. It's like summer camp for adults. Now, that's what the Bohemian Grove part of it is. But again, remember, that is 3 weeks out of the year. The club exists all the time. So what Bohemian Club members do as a group is largely limited to the Grove, but the rest of the year they're still engaged in different activities and the club still goes on. So when you're looking at the activities of Bohemian Grove, you're only seeing one kind of more semi-publicly visible part of what goes on. What you don't see is what goes on within the club building itself. That, unless you are a member, is completely opaque. It's much more difficult to get inside that building than it is to get inside the Grove.
Are you aware of any off-site meetings or things of that nature? Not even,
Well, what I'm not aware of, and there could be this, is anybody who's taken the trouble to sneak in with a camera into the Bohemian Club and film what's in there. I'm sure someone has probably tried that. You might not see any, but let's face it, anything you found in there, well, I don't know. You could find some kind of giant sex dungeon in the basement. That might be interesting. But it's unlikely that inside the building, what you're going to find are meeting rooms and offices.
Yeah.
And that's not as interesting as a private summer camp with a 40-foot talking owl. That you simply can't have that within the confines of the building. So, explanation that weaving spiders come not here is just means we're not going to talk about business. We're going to get away from that. I deal with insurance all the time, and when I come out to the Grove in the summer, I don't want to talk about insurance. Probably don't, but you might want to talk about other things that could be business related or politically related. And it's the idea of the Grove as a summer getaway for members makes sense. You could see it. And by the way, the whole place is organized just like a summer camp. I mean, you're assigned to different cabins, and those cabins have names. Like Caveman Cabin, Mandalay, Shangri-La, and you all become part of the cabin, and then each of your cabins has to work together. You're all supposed to produce some kind of skit. You can't just sit back and drink and relax. You have to look, you have the first thing you get there, you have to put on these robes, go out in the evening, there's probably mosquitoes, stand next to the lake and watch this whole little pageant take place. I can virtually assure you that if you were to go around and read the thoughts of the 2,000 or so brethren that are watching this going on, you would get different ideas. There are some people who probably think this is the most interesting thing ever. There might even be people who somehow attach a religious or spiritual significance to this. But you're also going to find people who think, one, their mind's going to be wandering. They're not going to be they're just going to think that this is the stupidest thing they could possibly imagine. Why am I standing here in these silly robes watching this silly ritual? Same thing. People dressed the same way, attending the same event. Yeah, it's like a music concert. Some people are going to be really into it, and some people think this is the worst crap that they'd ever heard. But they're all standing there in front of the stage, and you as the outsider can't distinguish between one or the other. There are lots of reasons why people are there. There are reasons why people want to become members of it and of the club, and in some cases it's to it's almost certainly not just for the 3-week summer camp. The club, remember, is a long-term. There are other things you're going to be involved in. It's the people you meet. Mm-hmm. It's why people join organizations. So think of the Bohemian Club as a very fancy version of the Rotary Club, the Kiwanis Club, the Elks Club, the Oddfellows Lodge.
Oh, yeah.
Why do people join? Well, it's a place to meet people. So you can have some kind of social connections and not just be lonely sitting in a room eating soup for one all the time. But it's also a way to network. It's a way to meet people, and you will meet people there that outside the meeting of the club or the lodge, you will then carry on that relationship, and that can then be very useful professionally. Mm-hmm. So yes, people are using these for professional networking. So the weaving spiders come, and they're not supposed to do any weaving, but they almost inevitably will. So I can give you an example of that. And one of the other features of the Grove Summer Camp are a series of lectures that are given by people who are usually invited to be there. Now, that's something else. The members of the club can attend, but then there are also people who are invited as guests. I mean, this is the same for any other kind of like private men's clubs. You know, if you know someone who's a member, they can get you in, at least on one or occasion, as their guest. They have an ability to do that. So there are some people, maybe dozens of people, maybe more, who are there every summer as guests of other members. Now, in 1967, one man who was invited as a guest was Richard Milhous Nixon. Yeah. Some of you may remember him as a former American president. This, from his standpoint, was a critical key in his presidential campaign.
Oh, really?
In fact, he described this. Nixon himself said this was the first milestone on my road to the presidency. I remember in 1960, he'd run against JFK. He had lost. Yeah. He'd then in the interim run for the governor of California, his home state, and lost. And so in the late 60s, Nixon is trying to become, well, he's retooling. He's becoming the new Nixon. And he's got to be vetted by, this is what you need in American politics. You need wealthy people to finance your campaign. You need money behind your campaign, and that money generally comes from rich donors.
So Walter Lippmann, 1925, is it Invisible Public or not manufacturing consent? That's Chomsky, but essentially that we the elite will pick the pre-approved candidates, and then the stumbling, bumbling herd is just going to weigh in on it.
Interesting you should mention Walter Lippmann, because he'll come up again in this process. Okay. So, this is
phantom public.
Leaving things to the masses, okay? Leaving things to a mob. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is
we'll say populist. That's a nice way of saying peasant revolt.
Yes. Do you want your political leaders picked by a crowd of angry peasants?
Right.
Okay. Well, or do you want them picked by a group of sober business people of influence, people of the elite? And still, we still got to define that term better. But so Nixon was invited to give a lakeside talk. These lakeside talks are sort of policy speeches, which sounds to me like, spiders weaving, but because you're invited to be there, now you're going to give a talk, and so these things are not casual. People are invited there for a particular reason, and they're asked to give a talk on something, and Nixon's talk was basically selling himself as the new Nixon. And he gave a lakeside talk. Apparently it went over well. Money began to roll into his campaign, and again, he describes it as the first milestone on my road to the presidency. He was being evaluated, and he knew it. And, of course, that's exactly the kind of influence that some would argue that makes groups like this, these seemingly private clubs, dangerous because they're kind of deciding who's going to be at least one of the contenders for the presidency. And maybe his lakeside talk was critical in this process. Maybe, if he had bombed it, if he had gone there and he hadn't impressed these people, he might very well have not gotten any further. But remember, I'd mentioned before, what's going on? So Nixon's invited to Bohemian Grove to talk to the people there. He knows this is important. He knows after the fact that it's important. What did he actually think about it at the time? Well, again, quoting Richard Milhouse Nixon, he thought in what he saw at the club, it was, and I quote, the most faggy goddamn thing you could imagine. Okay, he was not really impressed with the people or what went on there. And what he's talking about is all the robes and the skits and the rest of this. He just really didn't get it. So here you've got someone, a politically astute individual. It's not as if he'd grown up under a rock, who's brought in. He does his audition in front of the members, but he thinks the whole thing is fundamentally silly. Now, by the way, Nixon's critique of the group was echoed in around the early 2000s. Writer John Ronson was invited to go in and look around. This is, Ronson had written on other topics. And so the club thought it would be good PR to have him go in. Look, we're not doing anything weird here. Ronson claimed that he came away with a pervading sense of immaturity. He again was struck by what he thought were a lot of grown men trying to pretend that they were boys. And he called most of the cremation of care rituals and the rest of it is a pseudo-pagan spooky
it always
activities.
I'm younger than most, I guess, listening maybe, but seeing those images from the Alex Jones documentary or whatever when he got in, and then seeing the cremation and care immediately made me think of the Addams Family 2, where the kids are at basically this prep school type, Indian summer elite East Coast summer camp. And that seems exactly what it is to me, is a bunch of guys doing this weird Shakespeare. And you said it was 1870 what?
1872.
Okay. So
although, the ritual isn't there from the beginning.
Okay.
So in 1872, for the first decade or so, there's no Bohemian Grove. What were they doing before that? I don't know. Did they have like a little owl in the basement?
Drinking.
Hard to say. I think drinking, hijinks. Okay. We're all going to run around and we're going. So it's, there is certainly that aspect of it. It's a lot of rich guys getting out and letting off some steam.
It felt like rich kid East Coast stuff to me. That's what
it is like. Probably juvenile, but So this is now. On the other hand, you argue that people argue this is all a cover for something else. Both of those things can exist at the same time. Remember, it comes down to the mindset and the intent of people who are there. So you can have one person or many people who are there simply to have fun. Mm-hmm. All right, drink, dress up in costumes, put on silly skits, run around naked in the woods, consort with hookers, break trombones, whatever it is that you're doing, rot silk, curdle milk, do all of these things that you're not supposed to do. But for someone else, the same activities could carry a different meaning. So if you go back into the basic chronology of things as to how all of this kind of worked out. So remember, the club was established in 1872. I think the property at Bohemian Grove was acquired, I think early 1880s. The cremation of care ritual seems to have come along fairly early, about the same, but there was no owl. So the owl doesn't exist, and it's not the one today. There's no owl until 1923. And the cremation of care wasn't the opening act of the summer camp until 1913. So I think by one argument, it was actually something that was performed at the end, and then it was moved up to the beginning. So there's a change in choreography. So the rituals developed over time. First, you have the club, then the club acquires its country property. Then you develop the rituals that go with that. In 1923, there's the first version of the owl, which is much smaller. And the ritual, as it exists today, isn't really put together until 1929 or 1930. So it's been around for a while, but it's a gradual evolution of this process that takes place. Now, there were earlier members of the club who, recollecting things back in the 1920s and 1930s, thought that there was a big change that occurred around 1929, 1930. And that change they connect with when Herbert Hoover, American businessman and U.S. president, became a member. So the idea is that when Hoover moved in, he brought a bunch of politicians with him. He brought the Washington crowd. And that may be also, remember, this was something that had started in San Francisco, California, and it was certainly up to that period, its membership was heavily weighted towards Westerners. Mm-hmm. This was not something that was necessarily a big deal in Eastern elite circles. Right. It tended to be a big deal initially and sort of among the California business and artistic elite, and then began to spread elsewhere. But once Hoover gets involved, he then brings a lot of other politicians, people, hangers-on from Washington. And the main thing that happened is that in the critical estimation of some early members, he took the greatest men's party on earth, which is what they like to call it, and he made it much more ritualized and secretive. It becomes more difficult for people to get in. In fact, according to one ex-Bohemian, Hoover and his brunch brought in a bunch of people from the East Coast and D.C., and older members dropped out.
Oh, really?
A lot of the artsy crowd didn't feel that they quite fit in. The members have included, who were some of these people? Well, Henry Luce, publisher, David Rockefeller, who shows up in every single secret society you can think of. And also Walt Disney. Oh, apparently there is there is continual, some question about that. And again, many other people appeared as guests. Now, there's the question as to, all right, well, where did this come from? Why is it the Bohemian Club? Now, is it just the name taken from itinerant journalists, or is there something more to that? And then why the owl? Well, you actually find out that if you look at the owl, it's called the Owl of Bohemia. So what in some of the early things from the club, the owl, the emblem of the club is the Owl of Bohemia because it's the Bohemian Club. Well, here I'm going to introduce a secret society that most people probably have heard of. It was quite prominent at one time, and I think it still exists, and it's called Schlarafia. Okay. Haven't heard of Schlarafia? No. Schlarafia. Schlarafia. Does that sound vaguely German? Well, guess what it is. Schlarafia was a German initiatic order, which was founded where? In Prague, in Bohemia.
Oh.
It's now called the Czech Republic.
Right.
That's the actual Bohemia. Around 1860. And it also attracted who? It largely attracted writers, artists, painters, probably some poets, and journalists were a part of this. So the same initial sort of constituency you find. So it cropped up in Prague, Bohemia in 1860. And its group totem was virtually identical to the Bohemian Club, the Owl of Bohemia. And it was essentially designed as a parody of Freemasonry. And that's because Freemasonry then, in many ways now, was an upper class. Right. Freemasonry was expensive to belong to, and it recruited its membership from the upper bourgeoisie or the wealthy. A lot of artists and writers and poets didn't really go into Freemasonry. So they decided they would form their own group that would poke fun at the stuffed shirts of Freemasonry.
Isn't Oddfellows sort of like that? It's like a low.
It doesn't so much. It's usually as a kind of lower socioeconomic level. Although there were lots of people who could be an odd fellow and a Freemason at the same time. The closest you get an equivalent also in 19th century California of another secret society that was formed directly as a kind of mockery of Freemasonry, and that was Clampus Vitus.
Never heard of that.
Never heard of it. Okay. Well, okay. Well,
sorry.
Simply say, if you drive around, if you take a tour of the California or Nevada gold country, and you go to certain historic sites where there are plaques commemorating something, like here was Molly Maguire's whorehouse. Okay, they really like commemorating brothels, mines, bar. The social high points of the gold rush era. And if you look at a lot of those plaques, one of the things to look for are the initials ECV. And you'll find that on many of these. And that is Clampus Vitus, which is just sort of doggerel Latin that doesn't, some people argue it means clings to life, maybe. But Clampus Vitus was created in Gold Rush, California by miners as a mockery of the Masonic lodges that the high hats belonged to that they couldn't get into. And then it gradually transformed over time into a kind of historical society. An historical society. So by the time you get to the 1920s, it's full of academics, and it's closely linked to the California Historical Society, which is why they get into going around trying to commemorate historical places. Yeah. And it's also how they get into hoaxing.
Oh, no.
Right. So the most famous hoax involves Sir Francis Drake, Elizabethan pirate, sea wolf. There's in Northern California, north of San Francisco, there's a thing called Drake's Bay. Okay. And Drake did, and I think in the 1570s, sail up the coast. Nobody knows quite where they landed. Well, I think it was in the 20s or in the 30s, somebody went up around Drake's Bay, and guess what? They dug up a brass plaque that said that Sir Francis Drake on such and such a day claimed this land for Queen Elizabeth I of England. And that was taken as being real. It was a fake. Mm-hmm. It was a hoax perpetrated by members of Clampus Vitus in order to commemorate an historical event that didn't take place but should have. Or, Drake was actually here in this spot, but he neglected to leave a plaque, so we're going to make one for him. And that passed muster for a long time because allegedly many of the people who were involved in the California historical activity, academics, went along with this.
Interesting.
Okay, these are who knows better how to fake these things? And ECV has been accused, which is not the same thing as being convicted, of having done all kinds of fakery. That hoaxes is one of the things that they are involved in. But the group still exists. They still get together. They still like to dress like old time, prospectors, usually with suspenders. Black and red are their favorite colors. Okay. I don't know. Huh. So they didn't mean quite, but that's what ECV would be. And they did the same sort of thing. So Schlarafia were earlier a bunch of German artsy types who were inspired to the same type of thing. Now, Germans came to the U.S. in large numbers, and when they came over, they brought Schlarafia with them. And Schlarafia didn't have lodges; they had castles. That's what they called their lodges, because they had to be different than those stuffy Freemasons. And was there a Schlarafia castle in San Francisco? Yes, there was. And in fact, one person I know has tried to look through the membership of the early Bohemian Club and has noticed that there were a number of people with German surnames, and that some of those were, in fact, noted in newspaper articles having been participants in Schlarafia. So, while I think it's too simple to say that the Bohemian Club simply became an English language version of a German mock Masonic order, that was part of the inspiration. You could just imagine there were people there who were part of Schlarafia and sort of brought some of those ideas over, including the owls and the rest.
Is there a deeper meaning behind the owl? Is that a Bohemian symbol,
Well,
or is it
let's
like
see. Why is it the owl of Bohemia?
Yeah.
Are owls unique to Bohemia? I don't know anything about owls in Bohemia, what species are there, or whether there's a Bohemia. But where else do we see owls? Well, remember, owl is a sacred animal to Athena, Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. And didn't we? Yeah, we were just talking in another episode about a German secret society that had the owl of Minerva, almost identical to the one, by the way, here. And who was that? That was the Bavarian Illuminati.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? Okay, so the Bavarian Illuminati, the real Illuminati, had the Owl of Minerva as their emblem, and the Bohemian Club then in 1872, which doesn't seem to have too much of a plan for world domination that they talk about, also has the same kind of emblem. Now, here again, see, those are the facts of the situation. So the fact is that the Bavarian Illuminati had an owl as their totem animal, and the Bohemian Club had an owl as their totem animal, and Schlarafia had an owl as their totem animal. You might look around and find other groups who did as well. Owls aren't terribly unusual. People seem to have a certain fondness for them. People either tend to like owls or they're kind of afraid of them, but it's not too unusual to find them showing up in imagery. So, taking those facts, they don't explain much of anything. You just have the same totem animal show up in 3 different groups, all within about 100 years of each other. Mm-hmm. Remember, the Illuminati was formed in 1776, 1872. All right. Is there some connection between them? Is this some kind of recognition signal? Does it imply that groups that use the same totem animal have some sort of secretive link with one another? Or is it just because people like owls?
I think the link of Minerva, right? I mean, the first thing I thought of with Bohemian Grove about the East Coast stuff is like, if you have a proper classical education, obviously this is explained in Schlarafia, but let's just assume, I think it's fair to say that people were more aware of myths and legend than maybe in contemporary America. So I just imagine a lot of the symbolism, and same with Skull and Bones, other things like that. A lot of the symbolism comes from lore and different historical kind of
classical anything Greco-Roman.
Yeah.
I'd say it would be fair to say that in the 19th century, an educated person would probably be more aware, because so much of their education was based on that. That's not so much the case now.
Right.
In fact, if at all.
Not at all.
But, I mean, people might know, Plato wasn't he some kind of Greek? Okay, that they might be able to come up with that. A philosopher in one form or another. But those were things that would have been much more. Also, Athena is the goddess of wisdom, which means of knowledge, and therefore in some way kind of the patron goddess of what? Smart people, or people who think that they're smart.
Right.
So it wouldn't be. There's nothing in any way necessarily sinister about that. There's nothing that proves a connection. It's just one of those things that's kind of interesting and suggestive. It's the same symbolism cropping up in different groups over a period of time. Groups that don't seem to have too much of a similar purpose. I mean, if in some way the Bohemian Club is an extension of the Bavarian Illuminati and they're carrying on Adam Weishoff's plan to subvert all existing order and to create a new enlightened elite, well, maybe they just have a different way of doing it. Okay, his didn't seem to involve too much in the way of giant owls and robes. The whole story of the owl is interesting. I think the present iteration, it's not actual stone.
Really?
Well, the description that I was given by someone I think knew is that if you've been to Disneyland, you ever seen the Matterhorn? The artificial mountain in the middle of Disneyland, well, it's not built out of real stone. Yeah. It's built out of a kind of spray-on rock-like substance around a frame. And the story I was given is that the same material and, in fact, the same engineer designed the owl that designed the Matterhorn in Disneyland. Thus, more of the insidious Disney Bohemian Grove connection. You knew there was one there. So it's... And this, to me, if you look at the Bohemian Club and Bohemian Grove, there are sort of two ways to look at it. One is that it's just kind of silly. Again, it's just a lot of rich guys doing, maybe some important speeches are given, but overall, it appears to be silly. On the other hand, you could argue that that silliness does hide something which is more sinister. Why the robes? Why, of all the things you could think of to do, why do you decide you're going to enact a mock human sacrifice in front of a giant, what appears to be pagan effigy? A term which is often applied to the owl, by the way, is Moloch.
Right.
Okay, which is some sort of ancient Canaanite, Middle Eastern sacrifice. It was a real thing, but it wasn't an owl. Okay, I've never been able to find anywhere in that period where an owl. Moloch was a bull. It was basically a kind of bull-headed idol made of brass in which infants were sacrificed.
Wasn't that what the Israelites were sacrificing their children to?
They did it for a while, and some people didn't think that was cool, and that was it became a kind of fashionable thing to do. Let's have a baby and burn them in Moloch. Well, now there was that sounds quite horrible. I'm not arguing it wouldn't be, but it comes back to the question: why would people do that? Why would that become a kind of fashion? It was most commonly used in ancient Carthage.
Okay.
And the burning of children was a religious rite. But here's the purpose that was behind this. Childhood was dangerous in much of the past, and most children who were born would not survive to adulthood. That's just one of the things that you would have to confront, is that you would give birth to all these children, and many of them, perhaps most of them, would probably die. That's very upsetting to people, even when it's commonplace. So the idea was this: if you took one of your children, especially the firstborn, and you sacrificed it to Moloch or to the gods, that would guarantee the safety of the ones to follow. So, I mean, there's a certain logic. The logic would be this way. There's at least a 50-50 chance that this child is going to die anyway. Mm-hmm. If by sacrificing them to the gods, I can guarantee or at least improve the chances of the ones to follow, then more lives will be saved and more of my progeny will survive. So it's not one of those things that, you can see, it was just based upon the satanic glee of burning children alive. I don't know, for some people, it all depends upon the intent. But it was a kind of calculated deal. And this was always one of the things that you tend to find in what we tend to call ancient pagan religions, is that there was usually this kind of transactional activity with the gods. The gods control the natural forces, and if you offer them sacrifices, they will help you. And it's I ran across something the other day. It was a description. It wasn't Babylonian, but it was not even Sumerian. But it was giving a description of sacrifices being offered to the gods, and it said the gods gather over the sacrifice like flies.
Oh, wow.
Okay. But that's the way that the people imagine this, is that, it's like you've got a dead animal and the gods are gathering over it, because that's what they feed on. This is their kind of sustenance. So it's it's just going to show you that there's a backstory to everything. So Schlarafia is now, to finish off the Schlarafia bit, it had to have, one question might be, where did it come from? Was it just a mockery of Freemasonry? If you go back to Prague in the 1850s and the 1860s, you find out that there was another much more secret occult order. Okay. That is where people actually did dress up in robes and, I don't know, summon entities or doing whatever they did. And that was called the Shadowy, or the Asiatic Breathen.
Oh, okay.
So this is one of these occult groups that, what did they have? They had the wisdom from the East, some Swami, some guy with a turban had whispered a secret in my ear, and now I'm going to bring the enlightenment of the East. It's always the same sort of pattern that goes on. And so the Shadowy, or the Asiatic Breathen, existed in Prague around the same time, and members were in both groups. So people who belonged to what was a quasi-religious occult initiatory order, then on another day of the week went to the Schlarafia castle, where they were drinking, joking. I mean, much of the sort of thing in hijinks. In Schlarafia, because there were so many actors and artists involved, it was assumed that you would be involved in these plays. So to my eye, the connections between Schlarafia and the Bohemian Club seem fairly obvious and apparent. Now, on the other hand, did people carry more esoteric elements into it? Well, this is always a process. These organizations are always inventing themselves. It's just like that. In the beginning, there was the club, and then later there was the Grove, and then later still there was the Owl, and then later after that there was the Cremation of Care episode. It's always a process of changing itself over time, and it's always a matter of the intent of the individual and their involvement within this. So, here's a little aside, bringing another secret society that nobody has heard of. One of the people who was a member of the Bohemian Club was the former and late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, or Scalia. Okay?
Not Scalia?
Scalia, there we go. That's the right way to pronounce it.
Is it the right? I don't know if it is.
Scalia.
That's just how I hear it.
I don't know. In China said Scalia. Scalia. Let's go with Antonin Scalia. Okay, it's the American way to pronounce it. Yeah, all right. So Antonin Scalia was a brother of the Bohemian Club, and he attended numerous summer encampments. But he was also the member of another group. He was the member of the International Order of St. Hubertus. What's that?
I think you're going to say Opus Dei.
Well, that could have been, but we're not going to get into the Opus Dei right now. We're just going to stick with the International Order of St. Hubertus. It is a knightly order which was established in 1685 in Bohemia.
Okay.
Because who knew Bohemia was that important? So the International Order of St. Hubertus was founded in 1685, probably by a Habsburg, I would bet, in Bohemia. But it didn't have an American branch until one was established in Washington, D.C. in 1966.
Oh, wow.
So it's fairly... Of course, that's Anno Satani, as declared by Anton LaVey. That's when the Church of Satan was founded, 1966. All right, I don't know. There's probably no connection there, but I know someone's going to bring that up. So let's just get that out of the way. So he was a member of this international order. Now, what did this knightly order do? It was dedicated to honoring God's creatures by killing them and stuffing them and mounting their heads on their wall. Okay. So you're involved in hunting, and that's honoring. Okay. I guess it is.
God, people are weird.
So, well, yes, we could have named this whole podcast that. Maybe if we were forced by some sort of copyright thing, people are weird. So where does Scalia died suddenly? Some people thought mysteriously. At a place called the El Cibolo Creek Ranch in West Texas. Now, this is another exclusive men's club, hunting club. It was owned by investment banker and industrialist John B. Poindexter, who's also a member of the International Order of St. Hubertus. And that's basically what this was. It was a private hunting club for members of the order.
Okay.
And Supreme Court Justice goes there, is also a member of the Bohemian Club, and he dies suddenly, possibly mysteriously.
That's where he died.
That's where he died. And that's why. And so if you said there's something weird about Scalia's death, maybe, I don't know. People die at exclusive hunting clubs. Not all the time, but you know, who's to say you couldn't have a coronary after a stressful day of honoring God's creatures by killing them? So the interesting thing is that you hear about Bohemian Grove and Bohemian Club. Well, you hear about Bohemian Grove and you rarely hear about the club, and then you never hear about the International Order of Saint Hubertus, but it's an actual thing. They have their own kind of special robes. They have orders. They have a Grand Master. They have internal degrees. They have oaths of secrecy and initiation, plus dark green ritual robes emblazoned with a Maltese cross. Which it's okay. Templars. Okay. It's not, that's a Maltese cross isn't a Templar cross, but people think it is. So there we go. So it just shows you how the symbolism in different groups, and also how one individual can be a member of different initiatory or secret orders. Another guy who's certainly been connected with the Bohemian Club, and is also connected with the next group we're going to talk about too, the Bilderberg Group, is David Rockefeller. Because again, David Rockefeller seems to be everywhere at the same time. David Rockefeller also is a key figure in the Council on Foreign Relations. So we'll come back to the CFR because it has an interesting history. Although I'll argue it's not really a secret society because it doesn't demand, well, someone else asked me the other day, and I don't know why I didn't think about this before, and trying to come up with the quickest elevator talk about how you define a secret society, and here would be my question. At some point, were you sworn to an oath of secrecy? Okay? If part of the membership is being sworn to an oath of secrecy, that's the secret part. You're in a secret society. If you're not, maybe not so secret. Maybe it's just a special club. So the Bilderberg Group. So again, notice Rockefeller is in the Bohemian Club, and he's connected with the Bilderberg Group, and he's connected with the CFR. So the Bilderberg Group is interesting because that name means absolutely nothing.
Is it the hotel that
or something? So it came into existence in 1954. So here again, we'll sort of go to the facts. So the Bilderberg Group had its first meeting in 1954 at the Bilderberg Hotel in Oosterbeek. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but
Oosterbeek.
Oysterbeek. That's kind of what it's. It's Dutch, so it might have a in there somewhere, but I'm not sure. But Oosterbeek, Netherlands, it's a fancy hotel. And every year they meet at a fancy hotel. I mean, they probably reuse them on occasion. I don't know if they've ever come back to the Bilderberg Hotel, but that was just that's where they had the meeting. So if they had a meeting in the Motel 6, we'd be talking about the Motel 6 group, which wouldn't sound as... So there's no castle of Bilderberg. It's a hotel. That's where they held their first meeting, which means that that's not the actual name of the group. What is its name? There isn't one. None has ever been given. They simply go along with the idea of Bilderberg Group because it does nothing to describe a group. And this is an organization that is completely opaque. There's no record.
They don't produce minutes or anything like that?
No, there are no minutes. If there are minutes, they are never disseminated. If you are invited in there, as it said, you magically surrender any kind of offices that you hold. Once you enter it. I think that term magically is kind of interesting to include. Huh. So even if you're a member of if you're a journalist, you're not a journalist when you're there. You're invited. And what do we do when we're there? Well, we talk about things. It's purely an informal discussion group. An informal discussion group to which you are invited. So this is what it consists of. Takes its name for the first hotel that they met at in 1954. The real name of the group, if it even has one, is part of the secret. The meetings have continued every spring since that one at one fancy hotel or another. And they describe themselves as an informal advisory body to the Atlantic Alliance. So one of the terms that shows up a lot in Bilderberg pronouncement is the concept of Atlanticism, Atlanticist. And that all has to do, well, NATO is a part of that. Atlanticism was all about the combination of the United States with Western Europe.
In the McClure papers, there was a whole bunch of back and forth, people writing to McClure about a Atlanticist alliance, Atlanticist council. We were going to send 2 senators from every state to join this Atlanticist, And so McClure had to kind of put that down in the mid-'60s. But it was a real thing. I went and looked it up. There was discussion about having this.
Atlanticism. It is a thing. It is an ism.
Yeah, well, they wanted to have like this,
Today the term is often used for this as the collective West. Okay. So what isn't it? It's not Russia. It's not the Middle East. It's not China. It's not Japan. It's not Africa. It's not Latin America. It's essentially the United States and Western Europe. So think of it as that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is one aspect of that, but there are many others. And so Bilderberg is an advisory group. We just offer advice. We don't make policy. We just get together. And it's one researcher, a fellow who's done a good work in terms of looking at it, Daniel Estlin. His argument is that Bilderberg is a kind of extension of an older elite society called the Coefficients Club. Now, keep that name in mind because we'll come back to it. I'm going to get drawn off into the Coefficients Club. Right now, to me, the most interesting thing about the Bilderberg Group are the 2 people who were involved in founding it. Because there are 2 people. There's one in particular who's the real creator of the group. And his name is Josef Rettinger. Now, his name sounds German, but he's actually Polish. Probably. Okay, certainly he was born in Krakow, Poland. And Rettinger is an interesting figure because I'd bumped into his name earlier, and he has a kind of a shadowy career in international politics going back to the First World War. Because he was Polish, he was connected to the Polish national movement. Remember, in 1917, Poland wasn't a state. It had been erased from the map back in 1815 and did not show up again until recreated at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Rettinger became the general secretary. He's the guy who puts the whole thing together because he's the guy who goes out and recruits the other name, the kind of front man. Rettinger is, you ever heard the term gray eminence or eminence grise?
No.
Okay, someone, that means a person who always is kind of in the background. A gray eminence.
So kind of like a front person? Oh, not
the exact opposite of a front person. The back room. The person who's kind of running things from behind the throne.
Yeah.
Some people might argue that Henry Kissinger was a kind of gray. He was a little too public to be a particularly gray eminence.
Right.
But Rettinger actually has there's one biography, and that's the name of it is Gray Eminence. Okay, that's how he wanted. This is a guy who liked to work in the shadows.
Interesting.
He never held office. Never wanted to do that. Never wanted to be a politician. He wanted to be an advisor. Yeah. He wanted to be the Grima Wormtongue of people around him. The fellow who's sort of whispering ideas into their air. So he has a kind of interesting background. His whole career from World War I up until the early 1950s was as political activist, conspirator, probable spy. He was also a man who at one point in time or another was expelled as a political nuisance from Britain, France, and the United States. Guess what? He illegally crossed the Mexican border into the U.S. in the early 1920s and was caught and deported.
Interesting.
But then eventually at one point was kicked out of Mexico as a pernicious foreigner. But then later comes back, and he's an advisor on labor policy to, I can't remember which, one of the Mexican presidents in the 1930s.
Is it Porfirio Diaz still? He's gone.
No, it's
no,
not.
He's gone by.
Not
he's
Diaz,
gone in
and it's not
1910.
Obregón, and it is.
I don't know.
Anyway,
I forget. I did the whole Mexican-American War and or Mexican Revolution.
But he was quite active. He was active in labor politics in Mexico and also in France. So he's one of these guys who sort of appears to be on the left, but never quite.
He's a Machiavellian figure, basically, or
you can't figure out what he is.
Yeah, that's what.
This is the thing. It's very difficult to figure out. He did think that Atlanticism was a great idea, and that it was very important to keep the U.S. and Western Europe engaged. We got to keep all of these elements working together, and so that's why in '54 he approached another Westerner, a fellow by the name of Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. And Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands was then going to become the front man for the Bilderberg. And he would remain in that position all the way, I think, to the early 1970s, when he was forced to resign, having been caught in a scandal.
What kind of scandal?
It was military, I think it was a Lockheed scandal.
Oh.
The whole idea of getting rigged bids for jet fighters, a little thing like that.
Was he a Nazi? I've always heard.
What was he? He's Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. Does that mean he's Dutch? No, he's German. He was a thoroughbred German aristocrat. He was one of those monocle wearers who had a castle somewhere in Swabia. And but did he join the Nazi Party in the 30s? Yeah, because it was kind of the thing to do. Did he join the SS? Yeah, for a time. And then he married Princess Juliana of the Netherlands. Okay.
Yeah.
So he was a German nobleman who married his way into the Dutch royal family and, was a Nazi and was in the SS for a little while. Didn't take it too seriously. Probably just the costumes were a part of it.
Oh, great.
And then during World War II, then he becomes a patriotic Dutchman, which he really isn't, and joins the Dutch resistance and spends most of his time in Britain. But I think many of the Dutch had questions about, he certainly wasn't one of them. And you think of it this way, a person who, what exactly is their political stance? Whatever seems to be most convenient at the time. One might argue that Redinger seems to take the same, whatever sort of political camouflage needs to be adopted, whatever sort of political clothes you need to put on to be accepted and influence the people around you is what he would do. So this is my big question for someone like Redinger. Is he working for himself or is he working for someone else? What is his actual agenda? What is his actual purpose, and how does he get people to do these things? What kind of leverage does he have over them? But he manages to talk Prince Bernhard into this, who seems to have been a person who'd been pretty easy to talk into much of anything. Let's join the SS. Let's marry a Dutch princess. Okay, I'm down for it. So this is where the whole thing comes from. Redinger is the mastermind of the whole thing. This former Nazi term, pseudo-Dutch freedom fighter then becomes the other brother who is brought into it. And the whole thing here is then to create this advisory group. So, Bilderberg, what does it consist of? Well, the people there are regular members called the steering committee. No one knows who's on the steering committee. Nobody knows how many people are on the steering committee. I'm not even sure whether there is a steering committee. Initially, it may have been Redinger and Prince Bernhard. But some figures suggest that the steering committee consists of around 20 people at any given time. But you don't know who those people are. The steering committee then, every year, selects the people to be invited to come and engage in this talking that they're going to do. So, steering committee that consists of an unknown number of people who are nameless, then select. So, at the first 1954 gathering, what did that look like? There were 60 attendees. Now, were some of those attendees also members of the steering committee? Probably, but we don't know. And the attendees, you can actually get a list of some of these, were all Western Europeans, but also 12 Americans. So out of that 60, 12 are Americans. The rest are British or Western Europeans. And who were they, basically? They were businessmen. Some of them were journalists. In recent years, the number of invitees have gone up to about 100, 120. I think the biggest number I've seen is 150, but it actually varies. To modern times, somewhere between 100 and 150 people a year are invited. They are magically stripped of their office once they enter the meeting. They are sworn to hold in strictest confidence everything discussed there. So you're never. This is where the oath of secrecy comes in. You never talk about anything that we talk about, which is a little weird because this is supposed to be an informal advisory group. So what could be so secret about that it couldn't be publicly discussed? Why is mere advice supposed to be secret? And that has led some people, a number of people, to argue that, well, there's something more than advice. There is actually policy which is being created here. And that is impossible to say. Again, if you go back to the basic facts, it was formed in 1954 with the other two people who were the most important, rather mysterious figures, especially Redinger, who were involved in its formation. We know that it avows itself as an advisory group to the Atlantic Alliance, that it is informal, that the people who are invited are guests, that it has an anonymous steering committee of some kind, that it doesn't actually have a name, and that even though everything that supposedly is discussed at the meetings are advisory, is nevertheless secret. That's all we really know. The rest of it you could fill in. Your imagination can create the rest of it. But, does it all sound vaguely suspect? Okay. Yes. If I was the head of a secret police force and I found out an organization of this kind was operating in my country, would I be interested to know what they were doing? Yes. Yes, I most certainly would. So sometimes the reputation... So in the case of Bohemian Grove, where the reputation for sinister secrecy, I'd argue, is probably somewhat exaggerated beyond what you can see. In the case of the Bilderberg Group, I think it's underestimated.
Remember when in 2008, I think Hillary and Obama were both reported to have gone to the Bilderberg.
Yeah.
And I assumed when I found that out, probably a few years later, because I wasn't hip to it, it was the same thing that Nixon did at the Bohemian Grove. It was a clearinghouse. And if they represent this Atlanticism, Atlantic Alliance, I would imagine you're pitching your platform to the people of...
Well, one of the things, I don't remember whether Estelin said this specifically, but I know someone has argued that really what it, if you look at the invitees, and to the extent you can get a clear list. Remember, if someone says this is a list of Bilderberg attendees, is it? Did you get this from Bilderberg?
Yeah.
So I think that is a little iffy in terms of the authenticity, but the argument was that you see people being invited as guests. I think Tony Blair was yet another one, and they will show up before they've become president or they've become prime minister. And then very soon after they become elevated to some higher position. And thus, sort of doing the math, the argument was, well, this is what it is. These people are being brought in and they're being vetted. Mm-hmm. They're being basically asked to do what it was that Nixon did at Bohemian Grove, which was to give a pitch for themselves and then see whether or not they are supported. And this is, now, it could be. Maybe that. Is it impossible that there might be people who think that they should pick the leaders of the Western world? No. I'm certain someone like Redinger thought that was in some way his job. But the interesting thing, well, of the many interesting things about the Bilderberg Group, the group without a name, is that it's not the only one of these secretive Atlantic Alliance groups. Because you hear about Bilderberg. How many people have heard about Le Cercle? The Cercle. Circle of what? Okay. Or is it sometimes known as the Cercle Pinay? Who's Pinay? Well, Pinay was a French prime minister of the Fourth Republic, I think, or president of the French Republic. I can't remember which. an important political figure in France who held office was Antoine Pinet.
Okay.
And the Cercle seems to come into existence just before Bilderberg. So Bilderberg is 1954. Le Cercle is 1952. It holds its first meeting. And there are two key figures. One is Antoine Pinet, who's kind of the front man. That's why it's sometimes called the Pinet Circle, because he would preside over the meetings. But the other, the kind of Joseph Redinger of it, was a fellow by the name of Jean Violet. And Jean Violet was the head of French intelligence.
Oh, no.
At that time. So basically, the head of the French equivalent of the CIA was the key figure in putting this together. And Le Cercle also describes it is by invitation only, and it describes itself as a foreign policy forum of the Western or the Atlantic Alliance. It is avowedly Atlanticist. It's sometimes argued to have a distinctly rightist, anti-communist political slant. Many of the people who have been members, or at least who are invited to attend, also are members of things like the Knights of Malta, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the real Knights of Malta, the World Anti-Communist League, Opus Dei, a Roman Catholic secret society. And also lots and lots. Who are most of the people there? They're present or past intelligence and military chiefs. So here's one of the differences. Bilderberg doesn't tend to have a lot of intelligence or military people in it. They don't invite generals to Bilderberg. They invite politicians, industrialists, media people, God help them, academics. That's who they're going for. Le Cercle is mostly spies and soldiers. So that's, I think, an interesting way of looking at that. In many ways, these are simply two specialized branches of the same organization. Le Cercle specializes in military and intelligence policy, whereas the Bilderberg meetings are more for civilian and political policy.
So you said Le Cercle started what?
52.
52. So we're coming off of the Iron Curtain, and
this is the Cold War. This is why the anti-communism is a very important element, which is involved in it. There is an interesting, someone leaked, I think, a memo from a 1979 meeting. Now, here's another thing about the Cercle. It starts out, it's essentially set up by two Frenchmen. And Pinet and Violet remain pretty much running it until the early 1970s. So they're around for about 20 years. After that, however, the leadership shifts more and more into British hands. So you have people like ex-MI6 chief Anthony Cavendish stepping into leadership roles. So what does the retired MI6 chief do? He then becomes chairman of the
Yeah, you're never not intelligence.
So one of the interesting things about this 1979 memo is that it talks about certain things that were supposed to be discussed at the meeting, and one of them was changing the British government. But then there was a notation that, well, we can take that off because that's already been taken care of. We don't have to talk. Now, what happened in 1979? Margaret Thatcher became prime minister after a long line of what? Often of labor politicians, which these guys, which in the Cercle did not like. They at that point, they looked at British labor politicians and just saw commies. That's all that we see. So that was kind of interesting. We don't have to talk about changing the British government. That's been taken care of. The other elements of discussion was they wanted to discuss the financial transactions in support of political aims. That's basically it. We're going to discuss financial transactions for the support of political aims. It sounds like secret funding of something to
Yeah.
me. Just imagine the
Well-
different thing. We're going to discuss funding to achieve political aims.
I mean, you could obfuscate that however you wanted, right? It's like, oh, we're just talking about supporting candidates that we agree with, or you could turn it into we're going to find a way to.
We're going to
slush
get
fund.
millions of dollars to foment
Yeah.
a rebel army in the Congo in order to.
Well, how many of these guys were connected to NATO? If they're intelligence, right? I would
They
assume
all were.
All were. Yeah.
Okay. So nothing to see here, folks. Just a form, some president or ex-spook sitting around with some, and they're all talking about, financial transactions to achieve political aims.
Are there Americans that show up to this?
Some, although this is mostly Western European.
Okay.
I think this, but I'm not. There is some. That's an interesting question, but I don't think Americans aren't
Big,
in the same way in the Bilderberg Group. They're not overwhelmingly prominent.
Okay.
They're there,
Yeah.
but they're balanced. They're only a portion of this. The third item on the agenda was to try to figure out an international campaign to discredit hostile persons or events.
Oh,
Okay, so there are people out there talking shit about us, things we don't like to do. So we need to orchestrate an international campaign to
yeah.
discredit them. How might that be achieved? And then the fourth item was the creation of a private intelligence service specializing in a selective point of view. What?
These are great.
Okay, so we're all the heads of former intelligence services, and we're sitting around talking about creating an independent, in other words, an intelligence service, I would interpret this, that will not be linked to any government.
Yeah.
And it will have a selective point of view. Ours,
Yeah.
I would assume.
Yeah.
And the thing about that was particularly interesting about that last item to me is that one of the little sort of historical ghosts that I've chased in my research are the references to something like that. That is to a private intelligence service, an intelligence service that is not
Spectre.
that is not a state apparatus, but which will do work for governments for money. And something like that actually existed even before World War I. It's generally known as the International Intelligence Bureau. And it was headquartered in Belgium,
I think you've talked.
in Brussels. Because Belgium, being a neutral country, was the only country that had no laws against espionage.
Well, I mean, it seems completely logical, right? We've mentioned Spectre as kind of a stand-in term before for something like this,
Yeah.
but every major corporation has its own branch of intelligence. You have to think call it industrial espionage, call it brand protection or company, whatever. And these guys move back and forth in some cases because what do you do when you're in government? You go find the private sector equivalent of this kind
They're
of stuff.
just sort of, and so, yes, there really has been historically, or what exactly did that organization do? The best description of the International Intelligence Bureau, and it doesn't seem to have had a solid name, was that it would be contracted by governments to conduct actions that no government wanted to be connected with.
That's what I was kind of wondering as far as, I'm not saying that this is the case. I
No.
think there was a guy who got caught doing this, or at least that's the cover story. But what's the pipeline that got blown up?
The Nord Stream?
Nord Stream, thank you. Like, to me, that seems like a wonderful example.
Well, what do we know? Someone blew it up.
Well, supposedly
Who blew it up?
some Ukrainians.
Oh, it could be the Ukrainians or the Swedes or the Germans.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
you think about Blackwater or any of those groups,
Any of
it
them.
seems like that's the kind of stuff that they're describing right here is kind of a standalone.
The interesting is that the vagueness of the terminology. The thing is that people sitting around discussing these agenda items know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
But the thing here is to make sure that anyone else, like you and I, that we don't know exactly what they're talking about. Selective and a private intelligence agency specializing in a selective point of view.
This is the first one, 52?
No, this is 79.
79. Okay. Well, you got the same thing going on in the United States, right? I mean,
Financial transactions for political aims.
First thing I think of is Iran-Contra starts kicking off around this time, right?
Well, I'd have to say again, this would sound if I was in charge of any kind of security and I found out there was some group talking about stuff like this is suspicious. Okay. The people are suspicious. The terms they're using are suspicious. The conditions of their meeting are suspicious.
Well, maybe this is the time to ask the question that has been, simmering since you told me we were going to do this topic is, what do you think is the overarching ideology here? Are these groups, Bohemian Club doesn't seem as, evil as people think. This one is very clearly oriented in more of a kind of right-wing direction, but it's a state intelligence protection kind of thing. The other one seems like a more elite confab, but are they all really that standalone, or is there some, when we say elite, the first thing I think of is like C. Wright Mills, Christopher Lasch, they all have these theories of elite and what the elite mean and they do. So in the 20th century, if we're talking about the Atlanticist kind of...
Well, when it comes to Le Cercle or the Pinay Circle and the Bilderberg Group, my estimation would be is that these are joined at the hip. Okay, one is essentially the military intelligence aspect. That's the policy they're talking about. And the idea is, you keep in mind, you've got a lot of spies and soldiers sitting around. That's pretty much their way. They're going to see everything as a kind of campaign. Okay, we need to change the government. We need to get money to carry out these kind of actions. We need some sort of intelligence platform that anything they do can't be pinned on us, but they'll have a selective point of view that will be ours. So they're a kind of general staff. The Bilderberg Group is more in terms of broader governmental policy, but they both proclaim themselves as being advisory groups to the Atlantic Alliance. So there's just different branches of the same thing. But let's pick up this, elite. The term gets thrown a lot. So what do you mean? The main thing that elite is connected to is it means selective. Mm-hmm. We're talking about something being elite, and it's selective in the sense is that it means most people can't get into it. Mm-hmm. So let's take as a simple example of it, elite educational institutions. So if we talk about elite institutions in the United States, which ones are we talking about? Well, the first two on the list, Harvard and Yale. Okay. Then, Stanford, we kind of get,
let's say
will be included into it.
Penn doesn't show up in a lot of people's minds.
Princeton, usually they tend to be private.
Yeah.
Anything.
Cornell.
But overwhelmingly, Harvard and Yale.
Yeah.
All right. Harvard and Yale are the 500-pound gorillas of this. Princeton, Cornell, or maybe large chimpanzees. All right.
Don't tell them
they're still okay. But they're not quite in the same league.
Yeah.
And this is from someone standing way outside both of them. But I go, it's not quite. Now, what gives them this status? Exclusivity. Very few people who want to get in. Okay, they have a brand name.
Yeah.
So if you have a degree from Harvard, you have a degree from Harvard. Is that degree materially different than, let's say you have a BA in ceramic design. No, it wouldn't be it. You have a BA in history. Let's just keep it simple.
There you go.
You get a BA in history.
Denigrate those guys.
Did you learn any particular magic things that you wouldn't have learned somewhere else? Probably not. And I'm not going to argue that there would be no difference in the level of education that you would receive at an Ivy League institution or like Harvard than you would at, Cal State Bakersfield, for instance. But probably not that much.
Well, I had an argument with a former professor's husband who was a foreign policy advisor to a few different, I think, Republican and Democrat congressmen in the 80s and 90s. And I argued with him. I said, it seems like there's two kinds of academics you typically run into. Folks with those kind of elite credentials who may or may not be brilliant, and folks who went to some kind of state school, but can also fit that may or may not be brilliant. But it seems like there's the real divide, I guess, is between the people who are good rule followers and they make the grades and they do, they jump the hoops. And then there's people, despite their kind of sordid background, are really interested in what they do and somehow have made their way to, a position of authority within academia. He completely disagreed and was like, well, people go to Harvard and Yale because they work really hard. Well, that was kind of my point, is what I was saying.
They work hard at particular things, or they just get, I mean, both of those schools are wealthy enough that they don't actually have to charge tuition to anybody.
Well, there's the point, right? There's two people, or two groups within Harvard, and a mutual colleague who went there was telling me this. It's like, there's the elite, children of the elite, people with money who complain about, paying $5,000 for a pair of shoes or something like that. And there's people who got there on merit, and
people get in there for all kinds of. Now, this is the difficult thing, because anytime anybody who stands outside that and criticizes Harvard and Yale, it inevitably sounds like sour grapes.
Yeah.
All right. So
I go,
well, but this is what they have. People are there for different reasons. Some people got in because they worked real hard.
Yeah.
And there were people who got in there because, there's the whole thing about legacy admissions.
Yeah.
There were people who didn't work at all who got in.
Right.
That doesn't matter. I don't think the important thing is who gets in. It's that relatively few do. It is a very narrow funnel.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole point isn't whether you worked hard to get in or you didn't work at all to get in, or this was just handed to you in some way. It's that you got through that funnel. You then become part of an exclusive group
mm-hmm.
that most other people are not part of. I don't know one of the numbers that sticks into my mind, and I can't remember if it was Harvard or Yale, but originally 6% of those people who apply are admitted. Now that's very, very low. That's a tiny. Now, why can you do that? Because you're getting lots of people. Okay. You can afford to let in only 6% because you got plenty of others to fall back on. Okay. You're not one of these schools that has to worry about enrollment. We've pretty much got to let in everybody who breathes because everything, this is very different in terms of a state school that depends upon how many bodies we get there. And that's where our money comes from. So what elite institutions are selling is a brand name. It is an exclusive brand. And if you have a degree from Harvard, you have a degree from a school that not many other people do, and not many other people will ever have. And it has a name attached to it. And that's what you're paying all that money for, or what you didn't pay all that money for, is the brand name. You got a Balenciaga, and you've got is the knockoff handbag actually any worse than the other? They both those the same same kind of function. So elite is, first of all, it's highly selective. But the other thing that elite means, we talk about elite military forces. What do you mean by this? Is an elite unit. What do you mean?
Have the ability and to execute things that others can't.
It's the best.
Yeah.
That's what it means. Elite.
Yeah.
Is the best. These units are better than other units because they are elite units. This is an elite regiment of paratroopers. Well, it's different from other regiments of paratroopers. Why? Because it's better, which then argue is probably more selective in its recruitment or in its training, but it's better. So that's the simplest thing to understand. When somebody uses the term elite, what they're really talking about is that this is better than other things. Harvard and Yale or similar schools are better than other schools because they have the name, they have the brand name, they have the legacy to go with that. That's what makes them elite. And therefore, elite groups, or people who see themselves as elite, simply put, see themselves as better.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Can I throw a caveat? So let's say within the past 5 years, maybe 10, the so-called elite. So anybody who is populist or, antagonistic towards what they feel is an unearned status by whether it be political elite or nobody really, I haven't seen a lot of gripes about corporate elites, but to the point that you just made, we have the sense that we are better than you, and folks believe, that you are not because there's no merit there. But historically, you're talking about Yale and Harvard. They did have a level of competency that continues to, express itself in all manners of, because there's a network in government, in corporations. So how do those groups actually function when, it starts to rot, I guess? Like the ability, you're not making atomic bombs anymore. You're making derivatives and then tanking the housing market. Is that a form of...
Well, the continuation of being, let's go back further. Let's look at the distinction in the pre-modern period between commoners and the nobility. What did the nobility believe? They were better.
Yeah.
Okay, that was the whole. They were literally the elite, and they were better. They were simply better than common people. Common people were common, and they were stupid, and there was only despite the fact that common people could invent and do all kinds of things, and the nobility increasingly. I mean, the whole purpose of the nobility initially was to kill people. That's what they are. They're a warrior elite.
Oh, yeah.
They're a warrior class. And they were supposed to know. They didn't need to know how to read.
Yeah.
Okay. They didn't need to know how to write. They didn't have to be smart. All they had to do was be able to ride a horse and kill people.
Yeah. Do you like your grain? Do you like it not being stolen? I will.
Yeah. Okay. So I need, that's what I have the knights. The knights are just, they were a class of professional assassins in the service of the kings or the emperors, an elite above them. But that's what gave them elite status as people with a particular skill.
Sure.
But then as time went on, they just become a lot of effete snobs sitting around a chateau.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. They didn't really do anything, but that would be the best. The nobility thought of themselves as being better than everyone else, but I think how many idiots did they produce? All right. Okay. There tended to be a lot of inbreeding that was going on. I mean, none of them.
Sure.
I mean, let's look, not to pick on them, but they've had a whole series. The Crown made it. Let's take a look at the Saxe-Coburg Gothas, or as they're known, the House of Windsor. Is that a collection of geniuses? Really, I mean, Queen Elizabeth seemed like a fairly decent woman, but the whole group of them put together, that's it. That's the pinnacle of humanity. That's it. It doesn't get any better than this. No. Okay, the nobility simply had this status that was awarded to them. And the status wasn't based upon anything really that they did. It wasn't based upon their brains. It certainly wasn't based upon their education. And in the same way, all elites are, there's kind of, at one point in time, there was probably some ancestor who got lucky and didn't get killed or did something actual heroic and then got noble status for the rest of the family.
Yeah.
And then the rest of you are all just sucking off that tea for the rest of your existence while contributing nothing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
You got it.
So elites so the whole point of elites is to perpetuate their status.
Yeah.
That's what it is that they need to do, because that's what makes them special, and that's what makes them better without actually being better than anyone. It's just an affectation.
So would you argue that these societies, I'm thinking about James Burnham, to keep your power as an elite, you still have to display some level of competency, even if you yourself are not really that particularly good at anything, but you're bringing in people who are. And so at Bilderberg, you're vetting politicians that will, present some idea.
Maybe, or then you would have to look at the current crop of politicians.
Yeah, that's
have
true.
they improved?
No.
I mean, that's the other thing to consider. I don't know if you and I were talking about this. Okay, let's assume that the Congress of the United States is filled with the best and brightest. That is the pinnacle of humanity in the entire country. And that's why these people are leaders and making laws and holding hearings and doing all the stuff that they're doing. Really? Them? No. Okay, if you went across it, you would just find a collection of more or less fairly average human beings with all of their flaws and the rest of it. And I think most Americans, maybe your local representative is a decent man or woman in this case, but the rest of them are scum, right? Mm-hmm. A parliament of whores, which is my favorite. It's a parliament of whores. They're all for sale. They were for sale when they got there. I don't want to go into this. That's arguably it's a parliament, but that's one way of looking at it. So is this the best and the brightest, or is it a parliament of whores?
Mm-hmm.
Just depends upon your perspective. But this is where, why do you want to become a member of the Bohemian Club? Because most people can't be, because it costs a lot of money and there's a long wait list, but it's got It's special.
Yeah.
Eh? Most people will never be a member of that. Most people will never have the glory of standing in a stupid robe watching a talking owl. All right. But you as a member will. And it simply gives you the ability to claim special status, to claim in a sense that you're better than other people because you have access to these things that you don't. Usually because you have enough money to buy your way into it. So, is that a way of saying that all elites are phony? Well, not most of them.
Yeah.
Well, probably. Remember, when you're thinking about elites, just imagine the French aristocracy in 1789. Okay, there you go. And how many of them, like the Duke of Orleans, immediately jumped ship and proclaimed that they were the biggest revolutionaries ever?
Right.
Okay. Because it was simply a way of maintaining their status. You just go from one thing to another. So let's, though, skip attention to, earlier I mentioned this thing called the Coefficients Club. Remember, I said there was a researcher named Daniel Estelin who had proposed, I think it was Estelin, pretty sure on that one, that there was a kind of, that Bilderberg maybe was an extension of the Coefficients Club. And this actually kind of also brings us back into Council on Foreign Relations territory. And maybe that's what I'll actually start with, is the CFR. Okay. So, Council on Foreign Relations. Now, I would argue the Council on Foreign Relations is not a secret society because, as far as I know, it doesn't require any oaths of secrecy. You can go in, you can apply. I've known people who are members of the CFR. And there are two types of membership. There is life membership and there's term membership. Term membership is for 5 years. I think you have to pay some sort of dues to be in there, but that will expire. To become a life-term member, you have to be recommended by, I think, at least 3 existing life-term members. Maybe there's some sort of oath of secrecy involved in that somewhere. That becomes a little more involved. But there's sort of grades. So while I argue that it's not perhaps precisely a secret society, it certainly has characteristics that there are separate grades of membership. So the CFR goes back. We can say exactly where it comes from. Formally, it is inaugurated on the 20th of July, 1921. That's when the Council on Foreign Relations begins to function as the organization it is today. But there were groups of people meeting in New York, and I think in Paris, as early as 1918, who were meeting as a group called the Council on Foreign Relations. There was no such group, that was just the term they were using, but that's how far back it goes. What the existing council acknowledges is that their real beginnings was during the First World War. After the United States entered the war, Woodrow Wilson was looking forward to a peace conference. His whole idea is America was going to enter the war will be finished, and then we're going to rebuild the world, right? Mm-hmm. League of Nations, the whole thing. So what Wilson did is that he turned to American universities, mostly, and he recruited a team of about 120 to 150 academics, mostly from Ivy League schools, mm-hmm. and they formed a group called the Inquiry. And the Inquiry was to do all kinds of research. They were all divided. Some of them were going to specialize on Eastern Europe, or one just on Poland, or one on the Russian question, and one on the colonial question, and one on China. And academic experts were recruited, and they were all going to come in, and they were going to research the policies that the United States would then follow or propose or demand at a future peace conference. They were a think tank created specifically to come up with a research basis to make a just and lasting peace. This was the idea. The whole thing was managed by Woodrow Wilson's equivalent of Joseph Rettinger, Colonel Edward Mandell House.
I know this name.
Yes, Colonel House, Texas.
Oh.
Texan. Very mysterious. He's another eminent screens. House made his money initially off of investments in land and oil, and then of a lot of other sort of investments on Wall Street. But it's different. He's not an industrialist. He's not a financier. He's not a banker. He's just a guy who knows a lot of them, in the same way that he's not a politician. But he is Woodrow Wilson's advisor. He is his Grima Wormtongue. Okay, there's a vast conspiratorial mythology around Edward Mandell House, a good deal of which I think is quite deserved. He is a secretive, mysterious man who is always working behind closed doors to make things happen. He's always putting Wilson in contact with people, or people in contact with Wilson.
Do you know if he's connected to the whole Texas oil man kind of conspiracy group that's supposedly around, LBJ? And then
I don't think he's, as far as I know, there's not a connection to him with merchants and the rest.
Yeah.
He's the American gray eminence.
Okay.
In terms of influencing, he wrote a book. One of the things he's known for is a book he wrote initially under a pseudonym called Philip Drew, Administrator. And it's all about a political breakdown in the United States and a kind of civil war. And Philip Drew comes in and essentially makes himself dictator or administrator.
Yeah.
And is then going to create some kind of idealized quasi-socialist society. It's not really... And that's kind of what he seems to have viewed him, that House wanted to be Philip Drew, but he was always looking for someone else to kind of fulfill that role. And that, I think, has much to do with the Wilson administration's rather authoritarian policies. Okay, because one of the things that Woodrow Wilson did once the U.S. entered the war was to create a national police force, crack down on civil liberties.
Wasn't aware of that.
No?
No.
Okay.
No. I mean, rarely.
An official propaganda, the Committee on Public Information, CPI.
Didn't know about that.
Okay.
I don't know enough about his domestic,
And then, and the main elements of that were the Espionage Act of 1917, and then the following Sedition Act, which essentially criminalized every criticism of the government and anything that would touch upon the draft. But you couldn't do that. You couldn't go out and say bad things. That would be interfering with the war effort. Mm-hmm. And so there was a vast expansion of federal police powers and suppression of, I think, let's face it, folks, suppression of free speech.
Yeah.
But that was the type of thing that House saw as kind of necessary to run an orderly society. So he, I think, is the main architect. So he's the guy who's actually put in charge of all the eggheads who are supposed to come up with a factual basis for the peace conference. And that is, and out of that 150 or so, I think it's 108 of those individuals who've been connected to the inquiry who are eventually the initial members of the Council of Foreign Relations. Oh. Now, the big thing that House pushed for, the one thing that House was always is the real architect for, the one argument is he's actually the guy that wrote the 14 points, is the League of Nations. Mm-hmm. The League of Nations was absolutely essential. I mean, that's why the whole League of Nations is written into the peace conference, which it wouldn't otherwise be. And of course, as people may or may not know, the United States Congress eventually rejected American membership in the League of Nations.
Partially thanks to William Borah, right?
William Borah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Idaho, yeah.
It was, there were lots of questions about it, but that was the kind of first attempt at the United Nations. But the U.S. didn't participate in it. Of course, the Germans weren't in it, and the Russians weren't in it, and it didn't work anyway. And so it was largely an Anglo-French combine. I mean, the two big gorillas in the League of Nations were the British and the French, because the other main victor from World War I, the U.S., stayed out of it. This was a huge disappointment to House. This was the great failure of his lifetime. And this is what I think, others may disagree, but my interpretation of the Council of Foreign Relations is that it was an attempt to create an institution that would represent the interests and ideas of the League of Nations in the United States, where the League of Nations had no authority. The CFR was the American stand-in. Those people that wanted the League of Nations and didn't get it created the CFR in order to coordinate American policy with the League of Nations.
Okay.
And one of the other characters involved in the inquiry was Walter Lippmann. Okay, who then also goes into the Council on Foreign Relations.
Yeah.
So Lippmann is working hand in glove with Edward House. But here is another interesting part. So I said that the name Council on Foreign Relations was used as early as 1918 informally. It is formally incorporated in the United States in 1921. But in May 1919, in Paris, at the Majestic Hotel, there is a meeting. And it's basically a meeting between representatives of the American peace delegation and the British peace delegation. And by the way, House is also an instrumental figure in bringing the U.S. into the war on the Allied side, specifically as on the British side. Here's a little example of one of the people he introduced to the President of the United States, who he becomes friends with. In New York, through his Wall Street connections, House becomes acquainted with a British diplomat and former banker by the name of Sir William Wiseman. Sir William Wiseman came to New York in 1916, technically on a financial mission for the British government, but he's actually the head of MI6 in the United States, the Secret Intelligence Service, sent over to organize a British intelligence operation and then the neutral United States with the fundamental purpose, he is instructed, of bringing the United States into the war on Britain's side, not the Allied side, on Britain's side. That is his goal. And so what does House do? He meets Wiseman, who is the head of British intelligence in the U.S., and he brings him to the White House and introduces him to President Wilson. And thereafter, Wiseman becomes so accepted at the White House that he can go to Washington and he can go in and he can see Wilson without a prior appointment. Wow. Robert Lansing, the Secretary of State, has to get an appointment to see the president, whereas the head of British intelligence can go in and see him whenever he wishes.
Wow.
And Wiseman will send reports back to Lloyd George talking about how he has gotten into the highest circles and really how easy it is to influence the American president with the help of Colonel House.
Wow.
But that's the other thing, is that Edward House is a colonel, except that he's a Texas colonel and not a real colonel.
Wait, a Texas colonel?
Okay, it's a honorary colonelcy granted him by one of the governors of Texas.
I didn't even know that was a thing. And the National Guard or something?
Texas State Militia?
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess that's what it would be.
Okay, whatever it is that Texas governors,
Interesting.
Go like, here, you're a colonel now.
Huh.
Okay. So he's a colonel, but he's not a real colonel. And so the whole thing is mixed up in this kind of British intelligence. So House is, in my estimation, a British agent of influence. He always was. Everything he does moves the United States closer together, bringing them together. Remember, keep that idea in mind. The U.S. and Britain moving in sync together. And this is where in one of Wiseman's messages back to London, he's saying the whole point here, Michael, is to guide the American administration to keep its war policies in sync with ours. Not the French, not the Russians, not anybody else, but we have to create this idea that America's and Britain's war interests are the same. And even to the point that the Americans can't get the idea in their head that they have separate war interests. Britain's war interests are America's war interests.
Is this where, the John Birch societies, or is it them, or is it some kind of mid-century conservative, conspiracy or movement that were actually subsidiaries still of the British Empire? They came over and they took us back, or they're...
Well, that's what we're headed to in Rhodes territory.
Okay.
We're getting there. Okay. We're kind of working backwards from that point. So remember, this is 1919. So there's this meeting at the Majestic Hotel, and the meeting there is between the British representing the Red, and they're going to form an organization which is going to be called the International Institute for the Anglo-American Institute for International Affairs.
Okay.
That's what it was initially going to be called. But then, shortly thereafter, the point was made that, well, rather than having one Anglo-American institute, there should be two separate ones. Because then maybe that's, things too close. So there'll be two separate organizations. In the United States, it will be the Council on Foreign Relations. In Britain, it will be the Royal Institute for International Affairs. But they are, from that May 1919 meeting, agreed that they were the same organization existing for the same purposes in two different countries. Same organization, working to the same goal, but under different names. So there's not going to be any question, you wouldn't think that the Americans, the Anglo-American thing might be a bit much, but that's, it all began with one, and then someone waved a wand, and there were two. So the CFR was very committed to the idea of the League of Nations, but it's also very, very committed to the idea of Anglo-American cooperation in all spheres. So, with that in mind, let's go back and see where Cecil Rhodes and his Society of Elects go into this. So who was Cecil Rhodes? English, came from a kind of middle-class family, born in, I think, about 1850. He's 24 in 1877. So, 1853? Okay. He's sickly as a kid. He has asthma, basically. And he may have had some, I would kind of suspect that he had rheumatic fever at some point because he tends to have a somewhat damaged heart. His family thinks that that's likely to turn into consumption and he'll die. So when he's 18, they ship him off to the healthful climate of South Africa. Much drier there. Off to the Cape Colony. And he's going to go out and do healthy, manly things, going to go off and prospect for diamonds. Because this is now being gold and diamonds coming out of South Africa. And he does, and he's quite successful at that. And he makes a good deal of money. He joins forces with another diamond dealer by the name of Alfred Beit. Alfred Beit is connected to the Rothschilds in London. And what Rhodes does is he figures out there are all of these little diamond companies around. There are all these different people. It's like prospectors hunting for gold or they're hunting for diamonds. They're all competing with each other and they're all trying to undercut each other. And they're driving the price of diamonds down. And he goes, the way to rationalize this is to create a diamond monopoly, to bring all of this under one company. So he begins taking money, and as he accumulates money, he buys out other smaller producers. And then he and Beit initially are competitors, and then Beit joins with him. And they begin buying out others, and they're quite successful in this. And out of this will eventually come the gigantic De Beers Diamond Corporation. This is what Rhodes will create. The biggest diamond. They will control, by the 1890s, 80% of the world's diamonds. So in that sense, he's very successful, or he's very lucky. So in 1877, he comes back to England, where he begins taking classes at Oxford University. Still kind of amazed that he's alive. And at the age of 24, he writes out his first will, which again shows that, now keep in mind, Cecil Rhodes will die at 49. And one of the things driving him his whole life is that he probably doesn't have that long to live, which he turns out is quite correct.
Yeah.
So at the age of 24, he creates a will. And in this will, he goes, I dedicate my life and fortune to the establishment, promotion, and development of the secret society, the true aim and object of which shall be the extension of British rule throughout the world. So Cecil Rhodes is the British imperialist of British imperialists. No one ever outdid him in this case. He envisioned that every area, any significant, all the coastlines of the world should be under the control of the British Empire, directly or indirectly. All the mineral resources should be under the control of the British Empire. He talked about lying on his back at night, looking at the stars and just wishing that he'd go out and annex the planets. Okay. Now, the world was not enough for him. He actually imagined space travel taking over the entire universe.
Wow.
So he wanted to do that. He dreamed of extending British rule over all of Africa and South America, the Pacific Islands, the Holy Land, Malaya, the seacoasts of China and Japan, but mostly, above everything else, he obsessed over the ultimate recovery of the United States of America as an integral part of the British Empire. And that was his idea, and that's what he dedicates, and that's what his secret society was intended to achieve. To expand the British Empire, and most importantly, to bring the United States back under imperial authority. He was convinced that the Britons were the first race of the world. God was an Englishman, and that was why they were doing this, and the Almighty intended them to command Earth's resources. He wanted a one world order under British hegemony. So another vision in this case of a one world order. And Rhodes's idea was that the one world order was simply a universal British Empire. The whole world, not just a quarter of the world, not just a half of the world, but the whole world subject to the imperial control of Great Britain and the divine English race. This would be in the best interest of humanity. Everyone would be better off being ruled by the British. And one of the results of this is the Boer Wars.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so because remember, South Africa, the British controlled the Cape Colony, but inland there were those pesky, that's what I meant to say, Dutch colonists, bearded guys with rifles who weren't terribly interested in diamonds and gold, but damn it, they were sitting on a lot of it. And so one of the things that Rhodes did, using his secret society, was to go after that gold, which eventually the British Empire would get its hands on by provoking the Boers into not one, but 2 wars. Now, he went on to write 5 more successive wills. He would make little changes in them, but in each one of those, he would talk about his secret society. I think after, in 1891, the money was there and the society is set up, and it is called the Society of the Elect.
Mm-hmm.
So what did the Society of the Elect consist of? Well, first of all, it was headed by Cecil Rhodes. And then below him was the Junta of 3. These were his close friends. And those were, I think, William Stead, writer and publisher, Alfred Lord Milner, who would go on to become a grand poobah in British politics for decades to come, and the Viscount Esher, who was closely connected to the palace, to the royal family. Esher is best described as a man who was a fixer.
Okay.
Somebody, if the Duke of Devonshire got into some problem, he could go in and kind of smooth that over. But he had very close connections with the crown. And Escher, for instance, praised Rhodes as a splendid enthusiast of vast ideas, but he also thought that he was quite unscrupulous and treated people like machines. But nevertheless, he got things done. Now, below the junta, his 3, so there's Rhodes, there's his 3 buddies. There was the rest of the elect, and it's not clear how many they were. That started out being a few score individuals. It might eventually have become a couple of hundred. It was still quite small. And the Society of Elect were carefully people mostly chosen from political and business elites. That is, people who already have positions of money and influence. Same sort of thing that Adam Weishaupt wanted to recruit for the Illuminati. Remember? Yeah. People don't go out and recruit poor people. Okay. Recruit rich people.
Right.
They've got the money. And then beneath the elect per se were the Association of Helpers. And the Association of Helpers weren't full members, but they were people who could be useful to the society. Less influential, but promising. And one of those association of helpers was a fellow, just one of them, was a guy by the name of Leander Starr Jameson. Leander Starr Jameson was in South Africa. He was involved in mining. And Rhodes basically recruited him to lead a rebellion in the Transvaal to overthrow the Boer governments. So here's what would basically happen. Gold and diamonds have been discovered, especially gold, and hordes of miners, prospectors, had flooded into the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, these Boer farming republics. And they had now become a substantial part of the population. Most of those outlanders, as the Boers called them, were British subjects. Under the constitution of the Boer republics, they could mine and engage in businesses, but they couldn't vote. They had no political stance. So Rhodes used his money and secret society to create something called the Reform Committee. And the Reform Committee wanted to give the vote to the Uitlanders, which in certain areas would then be able to outvote the Boers. The Boers didn't like that. So Leander Starr Jameson created a small mercenary force, invaded the Transvaal, and then there was going to be an uprising in Johannesburg and Pretoria, and his troops would march in, and you see British rule would be established. A coup d'etat was fomented using members of a secret society. And that's how Rhodes could do this, because he could keep things relatively on the down low. It failed rather miserably. The Boers didn't cave. The uprising in Johannesburg and Pretoria didn't take place, and Starr ended up surrendering to the Boers. And as a result of the scandal, Rhodes, who by this time was the governor of the Cape Colony, was forced to resign, and he was replaced by Milner. Okay, so he was still in control. Yeah. And then that went on. The Boers were eventually goaded into declaring war on the British in 1899. That led to the Second Boer War, which was a complete disaster for them. It's also Cecil Rhodes, by the way, to give credit where credit is due, is the guy who came up with apartheid, not the Boers. One of the things he decided was that Native Africans were to have absolutely no say in anything. And he would specifically arrange to have a property requirement created for voting in the Cape Colony that not only cut out all the Africans, it cut out all the poor whites, all the Indian merchants who came in. It only kept the voting among what? An elite, which were, in many cases, helpers in his society. So this is the plan. So Cecil Rhodes is this rich guy who has a vision of creating a one world order under the British Empire, which means the Americans have to be brought into it. He dies in 1901. Control of his society then passes on to Milner. And one of the first manifestations from that, I think in 1903, is something which is called, the thing I mentioned before, called the Coefficients Club. And the Coefficients Club, it actually came into existence, in 1902 to 1909. And the whole point of the Coefficients Club was to try to bring different political elements together in the service of the secret society's goals. So the nominal leaders of the Coefficients Club were actually two upper-class socialists. You ever heard of Fabian socialism?
Oh, yeah.
The idea that we can just, there's not going to be any, nasty revolutions. We'll just kind of gradually legislate socialism one step at a time because it's good for everybody.
Well, it's their flag was the wolf with the sheep's clothing on it.
Well, we'll just kind of walk it in slowly.
Yeah.
An incremental legislative process. And the two leaders of that were Beatrice and Sidney Webb. They're like the power couple of Fabian socialism. So they headed it, and it was a dining society. This is the way it was said. Okay, we just meet for dinner, and we talk about things. It's like we go to a fancy hotel in the Netherlands where you get a nice dinner, and we talk about things. Notice a certain pattern here. It's just groups of people, right, and all we're doing is talking about things. So it's a dining society where select members shared views and debated policies. So Milner was a member. He's actually running the whole thing. So was Bertrand Russell, radical pacifist. Right. H.G. Wells, socialist sci-fi writer.
Right.
Future Foreign Secretary Edward Grey, the man who would bring Britain into World War I, was a member there. Also, I've seen it said, I don't know if it's true, is that Edward Mandell House, who spent a lot of his time in Britain, was also a member of the Coefficients Club. It would fit.
Yeah.
It would not be too great of an idea. Now, in 1909, the Coefficients Club was phased out, and it was turned into the Round Table groups.
Oh, okay.
Milner's Round Table. And the Round Table groups were extended, so the Coefficients Club just met in London. The Round Table groups had one in London, ones in the U.S., in Australia, in Canada, throughout the whole. By the way, another one of Rhodes' idea was that the whole empire should be organized in some kind of political basis. It's the Commonwealth.
Okay.
The British Commonwealth was an idea of. He wanted it to be much larger than it eventually was, but that's very much a Rhodesian idea. He's also the guy behind Rhodes scholarships.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Why did he say? What are Rhodes scholarships for?
The argument, right? So for what's his name? Quigley, Carroll Quigley, another historian, right? Had access to. He
said he had access to the Rhodes Milner Group's archive.
I thought it was CFR, which would be basically the same thing. As
same thing. Okay, that's you're kind of talking about.
Yeah,
Quigley was an American historian in two books: The Anglo-American Establishment, and then more notably Tragedy and Hope, where he talks about being given access to the records of this Rhodes Milner Group, which he argues is the single most influential organization in the world. And he's clearly talking about this is a continuation of Cecil Rhodes' secret society and its goal, adjusted as time goes on. And the idea was eventually get to the point that the actual reincorporation of the United States into the British Empire isn't feasible.
Yeah.
But what is feasible is to coordinate policy between the two, to create the idea that the Americans should take their lead from the British, which is, again, in World War I, exactly what William Wiseman argues his marching orders were and what he was doing. To keep the Yankees in line with British war. So there is no separate American war policy. There is only an Anglo-American policy, which means there is an Anglo policy that the Americans follow.
I didn't make it that far into Tragedy and Hope because it's a really big book. But you asked Rhodes Scholar, and so Quigley comes to mind. Scholar. Quigley comes to mind, and then who was his student that gives him, who's a Rhodes Scholar? Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton. Okay. There are lots of them. But here's what the purpose of the Rhodes Scholarship was. The Rhodes Scholarship is for Americans to study at Oxford. Or I don't know whether you can study at Cambridge as well, but it's to bring qualified Americans, ones that look like they might be upcoming, that would be in a position to hold political office. And as Rhodes put it, to bring them over and give them a proper English education. To turn them back into the little Englishmen that they all should be. To brainwash them to believing in this, because they would now be brought into the temple of learning in England, where they would learn to think like an Englishman. Well, that was the purpose.
It brings me back to my question I asked you before we started, and then a little while ago about ideology. So these secret societies, right, perpetuate rule number one: as an elite, whether you're competent or not, elite, deserving of the status or not, it's like a state to perpetuate your power, right? So they're here, they're meeting, they're talking. Take the Alex Jones line. They're planning to depopulate all of us because we're all, Are they doing that, or are they talking about essentially all the ones we've talked about today? Essentially, this Rhodesian, maintenance of the West, the same statecraft that you see from every other,
Well, Rhodes was a guy with a vision, a kind of fanatical vision. And just like his idea of annexing the planets, his idea of simply reincorporating the U.S. wholesale into the British Empire was politically unrealistic. But then what's the next best thing? So it's up to people like Mill and the others to figure out how to achieve the general goal. And the general goal is that you don't have to bring the United States back under the authority of the crown in order to achieve a synchronization of Anglo-American world policy. And I think you could argue, too, that that effectively was achieved in some way or another. I mean, look, there are only 2 countries in the world, as far as I know, that talk about having a special relationship. All right?
Yeah.
There's that term. What is special relation? Well, it means that we're sort of together, we're sort of allies in a way that other countries aren't allies. So the United States has been allies with France in 2 world wars. We never talk about having a special relationship. And that's right out of William Wiseman's playbook. That was his whole idea, was that the U.S. and Britain were in the war together. They were allied with France and Italy. Yeah, that was true. But we're in the war together. We are a common entity when it comes to fighting Germany. What eventually happened, I think, I would propose, is that over time, the power balance simply shifted, particularly at the end of the Second World War. The British Empire was bankrupt. They could no longer afford the empire. The U.S. was in a much stronger position. But the U.S. had, in effect, the U.S. basically just stepped in and took over the hegemonic role that the British Empire had previously had.
Wasn't there FDR and Churchill on a ship for like 8 days, basically negotiating the turnover of the keys to the empire? I forget when that was.
And so there's a special relationship. The power. Rhodes would probably have been horrified about that because it meant that the actual center of power shifts from London to Washington, and yet the basic function has been achieved. I mean, it ended up not with the U.S. becoming another part of the British Commonwealth. It ended up with Great Britain effectively becoming the 51st state.
Yeah.
I know that British listeners won't like it. Some of them will know exactly what it is that I'm talking about. And let's face it, cousins, that's true.
Yeah.
But that's how this whole situation, so how did you end up under Yankee hegemony? Cecil Rhodes is the guy you have to thank for that, because he wanted the 2 things together so much that you eventually get it. But the economic reality meant that the center of gravity shifted to the other side of the Atlantic. But I do think, in a sense, that Rhodes' idea was achieved. Mm-hmm. He did effectively, if not totally, unify the U.S. and Britain. He combined them in common endeavors in a way that could not have been done otherwise.
This is speculation, but why do you think the Trump administration is making such a big stink about, Europe can take care of itself, Britain can take care of itself kind of stuff? Is that...
Well, they can take care of themselves.
Yeah. Okay. But is it a breaking of the special relationship kind of thing?
I don't know. But see, Britain's still separate.
They did step
Britain
out
isn't
of the
EU.
Yeah.
All right. It's not part of that anymore.
Right.
And I'd even kind of wonder how, there are lots of reasons why people in Britain didn't want to be part of the EU any longer. But it also means that once you're separated from,
that block.
It's like 1984. Okay. This is where you see this pattern. Is in Orwell's the most prophetic book written in the 20th century. Oh, we should do a whole episode on that.
Sure.
But so if you look into the political geography, fictional geography in 1984, you have 3 countries in the world: East Asia, Eurasia, and Oceania. Mm-hmm. And Oceania includes Britain, but it's called what? Airstrip 1.
Yeah.
And it's just this little part of it that's floating off the edge of Eurasia, of Europe. So even in Orwell's idea, his idea was that the sort of inevitable political destiny of Britain was to become an extension of an empire that was largely based in North America. That's one of the interesting things about 1984 is you get a description of what's going on in England under Big Brother, but what the hell is happening on the other side in the rest of Oceania?
Yeah. Is
it the same Big Brother or is it a different Big Brother?
Well, that's what it sounds like to me. It's 3 different power blocks basically arguing, fighting against each other. And so the consolidation, you see this in world history throughout different empires, but there's the empire, the core, and then you have the satellite states that
could be it. There are people who, it's like people hash over Tolkien's trilogy as if it was a real place. and Orwell's 1984 world is not a real place. But so is the Big Brother that Winston Smith is the sort of god over Airship One. Is that the same ruler that in the rest of Oceania, which includes all of the Americas and Australia, is that the same guy or is it someone else? Well, we don't know because he didn't write it that way. But remember, it's just a book, and that's a plot hole.
Well, one tie-in. So I mentioned James Burnham. The foreword of his book is Eric Blair or George Orwell. And it was some article, is a reprinting, but it was some article he wrote as a review of, I forget the name of the book. But it was basically Burnham laying out, hey, this is 1942. This is not the Second World War is not actually a battle of ideologies. It's a battle of managerialism. So it's shifting. Anyway, let's do an Orwell episode. That'll be good.
I might do that. So yes. So Carroll Quigley. So if you ever tend to hear about the Rhodes-Milner Group, Carroll Quigley is the guy, because he's the only guy who actually says that I know about this organization. And I was able to see their documents, and he describes them, I think in the process, he goes, they operate much like the communists are said to operate, secretively.
Yeah.
And he goes, I don't necessarily disagree totally with their goals, which I guess is why he was given some kind of access to this. Now, here's an interesting question, and it has to be asked in all fairness. Is Quigley just bullshitting us?
What would be his reason? He was a Georgetown.
The question, why would people never have a reason to do that. You know why people bullshit most of the time? Because it's fun to do it. Okay. That's...
Yeah, why does the secret historical society force?
It's just they can get away with it, or they create a story. So I don't think that he is, but I'm just saying that in fair, I have to bring up the possibility that we all assume that, well, because Carroll Quigley said this, it must be true. He's a professor. All right, that's got to be it. It must. Well, you don't have any other evidence. You don't have the raw material he got this from. So I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say that what I think he says he saw, he actually saw. You're still getting his interpretation. Now, there are people who disagreed with him. I mean, generally in academia, the general response you get is that no one wants to come out and say that Carroll Quigley might have been crazy or that he was lying. They might say, well, he might be exaggerating. We don't really know. And he could be. But there was one guy, Sir Iveson McAdam, who I suspect is a Scotsman, who was quite willing to just come out and say that he thought, well, first of all, he noted a couple of things about Quigley. Well, first, he was an American. Two, he had Irish ancestry. Which meant that, if he's Irish, the Irish, and this was McAdam's whole idea. He was therefore just inherently anti-British, and everything would be slanted in that direction. So he's an Irishman, don't believe him. He was infused with anti-British prejudice, and then to add things, he called him crazy. He's a crazy Irishman. Don't believe a single thing that he says. So someone actually came out and said that. Now, on the other hand, who was McAdam? Well, he was a member of the Association of Helpers, and he was also editor of the Round Table's Journal, and he headed the Royal Institute for International Affairs. So he's part of the organization.
Not biased at all, yeah.
No. So why would he say anything about that? So comes down to a question: who do you want to believe? In terms of that. Now, there are other interesting things that the Round Table has connections. Remember I said that one of its early incarnations, the Coefficients Club, began as a dining society. And there's a long history of dining societies in British elite organizations. And that brings us to another British university society, the Cambridge Apostles. Remember the Cambridge Apostles? Okay, they mostly come up in connection to the Cambridge spy ring.
No.
Okay. Kim Philby, Anthony Burgess, Donald McLean. Okay. These were Soviet spies recruited within the British elite. From Cambridge, and all of them through the Cambridge Apostles. It was that group. So what are the Cambridge Apostles? Well, they go back to 1820. Okay. And they were a dining discussion society. And apostle members were carefully chosen for a cross-section of ideological and sexual preferences. The aim wasn't to create a club of identically minded people, but a diverse group united by allegiance to the society. Now, that, by the way, all I want to say at this point, I'll come back to it, Skull and Bones has exactly the same goal.
Okay.
So the idea was you create a society and you create people who are going to go into different walks of life, have different opinions, but they will all have loyalty to this particular group because they have all been selectively admitted to it, sworn to loyalty and secrecy. So, a society with influence in all camps. Now, one of the things that people talk about are the apostles, the members who are then enrolled in the university, but then nobody remembers, well, what happens when you graduate? Well, when you graduate, you don't cease to be a member of the group, but you're no longer an apostle, you're an angel. So,
sure,
the apostles who have gone on to the greater world and achieved prominent positions in government or business and elsewhere, those people are now the angels, and
right.
They literally will become the guardian angels of the apostles coming in. So this is a life. It's not just something you do in college. It becomes an organization that will guide you for the rest of your life. And these, of course, and Cambridge and Oxford are they're the models for Harvard and Yale, aren't they?
Right.
They are the most elite institutions. There are many other British universities, but those are the two. Those were the finishing schools of the British elite,
right?
Certainly in the 19th and early 20th century. Now, what happened is that in the 1920s and in the 1930s, the apostles in Cambridge University, and remember, there was a tendency to recruit people of all kinds of political backgrounds. One of the things that became quite fashionable at Cambridge in the 20s and 30s was communism.
Mm-hmm.
And Soviet intelligence used the apostles as a recruiting ground because this is where people were going to go on to other things. And if you could recruit them to the cause there, they would go on not to serve the interests of the apostles, but they would go on to serve the interests of the proletariat. And thus you get this Cambridge Five. The 5 spies that were recruited, Kim Philby being the most infamous of the lot. But those spies then went on to infiltrate British intelligence and wholly compromise it by the 1950s, and also through that actually begin to compromise parts of American intelligence.
Right.
So you have, the interesting thing is you got the Cambridge Apostles that are an elite organization, values a diversity of opinion. That diversity of opinion eventually opens them up to communist infiltration and manipulation. And now today they're best known for being the source of the greatest branch of British traitors since Guy Fawkes. Okay, that's what would happen. Another case of when one secret society, in this case the KGB, we'll call it, infiltrates another and begins to turn its members to their purposes. Now, I mentioned before, that's what we described about the Cambridge Apostles, particularly in recruiting people in every branch, is very much true for maybe the most famous or infamous, or at least the most talked about American collegiate secret society that's not a fraternity or sorority, and that is the senior societies at Yale. And the most important, there are at least a dozen of them, and nobody really there's Scroll and Key, Wolf's Head, others, but the only one that tends to get much attention because it's had presidential candidates, because the Bush family is involved with it, is Skull and Bones. So here again, let's try to get the basic facts up front. So Skull and Bones was formed in 1832 at Yale University. And I think the 2 key founders were Alonzo Taft was one. Oh, and I can't remember the other fellow's name.
Wasn't DuPont somehow connected?
DuPont's get into it, but not originally. Taft and Russell. A fellow by the name of, last name is Russell. Taze Russell.
Not connected to Sir Lord. Is it Russell? Oh, is it Russell Wallace or Wallace Russell? Never mind.
So it's the Russell, both wealthy New England elite families. And they named it. So they come back. they formed this at Yale in 1832 after going on an exchange to Germany. And they argue that this is a German secret society. We encountered this really cool secret society in Germany, and we're going to establish a branch here. Now, do some people claim, what secret society in Germany? Oh, Illuminati. Okay, remember, Bavarian Illuminati went somewhere. Was that the group that they encountered? I don't know. Maybe. The German universities were full of Burschenschaften, of, German students seem to spend most of their time slashing each other in the face with swords or forming secret societies. I mean, they did. Look, let's have a sword fight and cut a big scar, and that will be the thing that will define me for the rest of my life. So they like doing that. How much can you trust their other decisions? I don't know. So, but they this is what they said. That we came across it in Germany. We thought it was cool, and we're gonna number the chapter 322. What does that mean? Is this a random number we picked? Is it now the one idea I think that the group itself is promoted is that 322 BC is the death year of Demosthenes, a Greek the guy who put pebble in his mouth and tried to speak more clearly than I am today. Is that it? Or is that just some story that they told? Or is this branch number 322, which means this is a society but who knows? Okay, this is like membership cards for political parties. We'll start it at 5,000 just to make us look more important than we already are.
Yeah.
You see, that's a rule you can always depend upon. It's much like the fish never getting smaller in a fish story. Okay, people very seldom will tell stories that will make them look less important than they actually are. They will always tell stories that will make them look more important than they actually are. So maybe it was only branch number 32. Well, 322 looks bigger, but you don't know. You don't know what the number. You just know that's the number. You don't know what the number means. And these are senior societies. So it's not like a regular fraternity that you join when you go into college and you're in there for generally the whole 4 or 10 years or however long it takes you to get the degree. Senior societies, you're only in it for your senior year. You're picked generally, I think, the spring or the end of your junior year. And there are only 15 people every year that are picked. Up until the 1990s, they were all male. Women now have been admitted to this.
So who's running these things if they're all seniors? Is your fifth-year seniors running?
Well, the organization continues on. Remember, it's...
Oh, same as... Okay.
The idea here is that this is an organization that you're being recruited to be part of a secret society in college. You're really not. Your college career is almost over with.
Yeah.
You've now demonstrated that you're a person that the group is interested in recruiting. So you're picked in your last year, 15 of you. And then very quickly you graduate and you go on to the outside world and another 15 people are picked. So the whole purpose of Skull and Bones isn't for college students. It's for people who are going to go beyond. It's the first step in going beyond college.
Well, I just mean who's administering all the rights and all the stuff that they do? Is John Kerry coming
back? The Russell
back?
Trust.
Okay.
The trust that was set up by
really?
Russell to fund, and they have their own, they even have their own version of Bohemian Grove. It's called Deer Island.
No shit.
Up in the St. Lawrence. Yeah, they've got their whole clubhouse and they have meetings there.
You weren't kidding when
every
you were
year
talking about the secret societies of the elite. I wasn't thinking about this.
No, they got their own secret island hideaway. And then they do the same sort of thing that, and this may have been modeled on it to a degree, that they would tend to pick 15 members of the upcoming senior class are chosen or tapped each, because they go around and they knock on your door and then tell you have been chosen. You've been chosen for a unique honor. And so the emphasis is on diversity as opposed to uniformity. A typical year might include a couple of artists, a prominent jock or two, some eggheads, a notorious radical, and a staunch conservative. So they might pick William F. Buckley and Gore Vidal, if one can imagine them being in the same class. Okay, both of those people, and for anybody who doesn't remember William F. Buckley and Gore Vidal, two American gabby intellectuals of the mid-century who hated each other.
Yeah.
Okay. But had very interesting hate-filled spleen-like conversations between the two of them. But they could conceivably be part of this. So they're not there because they think alike. And the whole point of this, again, as with the Cambridge Apostles, is that upon graduation, people would spread into all points of the compass. You would have influence on the left and the right. You would have influence in the military and business, in diplomacy. All of those things would fit together. And of course, the classic example is the U.S. presidential election of 2004, where both candidates, George Bush and John Kerry, could proudly boast of being bonesmen.
Yeah.
Something which, when they were talked about, said we can't really talk about that. Okay, we can talk about everything else, but we don't talk about it. They were true to their oaths of secrecy. It's not just a collegiate experience. It's a lifelong, you graduate to join a legion of bonesmen ensconced in places like Congress and Wall Street. Just like the Bohemian Club, Skull and Bones has its own rustic retreat, Deer Island. And of course, there are people who are bonesmen who are also members of the Bohemian Club. Mm-hmm. You could get invited to both parties. That wouldn't be that unusual at all. There is a book about that, written by Anthony Sutton, who wrote the books, called Skull and Bones, America's Secret Establishment. Is he making too much out of it, too little out of it? You'd have to read the book to judge for yourself. One researcher, Alexandra Robbins, who occasionally reaches a bit, speculates that it could be an outgrowth of the Bavarian Illuminati. Could be. But you don't know. Or is it just another instance of privileged males and today some females bonding for fun and mischief? What's often overlooked is that Skull and Bones isn't alone. Yale boasts at least 15 elite senior societies, and Harvard probably as many more. And there are others at university as well. So this is not a unique thing. Skull and Bones is often treated as if there's nothing like this in the world. No, there are all kinds of things like it in the world. So the last thing we'll come to takes us to a different place. It takes us to Germany in the 19th and 20th centuries. And no, I'm not talking about Nazis. Well, not right away. Well, they'll come in because we mentioned Germany. And so the next word is Nazi. Okay. My apologies to Deutschers out there. I know that hundreds of years of German. Why should hundreds of years of German culture be compressed into 12 years of unpleasantness? Nevertheless,
we'll do an episode on Steiner.
You made your bed. So, it's a group called, well, I guess the question is, are any of these groups, we talked about their actions being kind of suspicious, vague, the occult overtones of the cremation of care ritual. Is there one of these elite secret societies that is, admittedly, diabolical? Are they headed by a demon? Well, they claim to be. And that is the German Freemasonic Order of the Golden Centurion, or the FOGC.
Okay.
Okay. The first thing that has to be pointed out is that it actually has nothing to do with Freemasonry. This is another order that uses the Masonic name, and they have a roughly initiatory order of different levels, but it's not part of regular Freemasonry. And the society dedicates it to the theory and practice of black magical techniques for the attaining of life goals. So its members are bound by oaths of blood rituals and mental pacts. And initiates were promised, if they were successfully admitted, personal advantages, influence, power, and wealth. It's a Faustian bargain, literally. So, if you are admitted and sworn into the lodge, if you accept the overlordship of our demon master, then you will be rewarded with all the riches of earth for a while. There's always a catch. It was formed in Munich around 1843. And there actually does seem to be something. Now, whether it actually practiced this is something else. But there was a Masonic Order of the Golden Centurion that appeared in Munich around 1843. Most of the people who joined it came from the first generation of Germany's rich industrialists. Remember, the 19th century Industrial Revolution was going on. Some people got very rich off of that process. And rich people like to form what? Secret societies to hang out with other rich people. So they'd attained, like Cecil Rhodes, they'd worked hard to attain their wealth and power, and they wanted more, and this group was just willing to sell their souls in order to do that. So the FOGC's membership was strictly limited to 99. No more than 99 men could be members of it at any given time. The honorary position of the 100th member was held by the lodge spirit, which is either described as Bartzabel, the spirit of Mars or war, or Asmodeus, the king of demons. That seems to be back. The interesting thing I found about Bartzabel, the spirit or demon of Mars or war, is that that's the same spirit that was conjured by Aleister Crowley at a gathering in 1910, where he conjured it up to ask whether there was going to be a war. Guess what? There was.
There was, yeah.
Okay. They go, yeah, and they got it right. Britain will be at war with Germany and Turkey. Okay. So I just find it interesting that Crowley is dealing with the same thing. So Bartzabel or Asmodeus, take your pick. Lodge members swore absolute obedience to him, and they reaffirmed that every 5 years. You had to come back and swear loyalty again, and you had to do that on a specific day, St. John's Eve, June the 23rd, basically the summer solstice. Now, if a member had died in the interim, in the preceding 5 years, one or more members, there was no real problem. You selected a couple of more to fill in it. But if there were still 99 people around the table, well, someone had to be sacrificed. And that would mean that they would draw lots, and the person who received the single black ball became the lodge sacrifice, who was then required to drink poison in front of everyone.
Jeez.
Now, sometimes, supposedly, people balked at doing that. They refused to drink the poison. And in that case, they had to be disposed of in other ways. So in the 1920s, when word of this began to circulate around Weimar, Germany, freakiest place on earth in the 1920s. Remember, it went from being like freakiest place on earth to the most controlled place on earth in the Nazis. But, okay. It's, so... certain assassinations. So one was the death, I think, in 1924 of German mega industrialist Hugo Stinnes. He died rather abruptly, supposedly from natural causes, complications from surgery. But the rumor was that he was a member of the FOGC, and he was killed off. And then in 1922, which isn't 5 years in 1924, who I don't know how that works, the execution of businessman turned foreign minister Walter Rathenau, who was assassinated by gunmen. So, again, there's a lot of mythology that surrounds itself with this, but the group does seem to have existed. That's about the only thing that can be said for certain. The rituals that are described, there's really only one. I think there's really only one source for the description of the rituals. It's repeated by others, but it all seems to go back to this one fellow, Frabato, who was a German occultist who may have known what he was talking about. I'll say this, I don't think he's making it up. He might be embellishing it to a certain degree. But that was a group. Now, one of the questions is that what happened to the Golden Centurion once the Nazis came along? Well, I think it's in 1934, the Nazi regime abolishes all oath-bound secret societies, all of them, Freemasonry, right. All of them, and the Golden Centurion is listed among those. So it seems to have existed. It was there, or they thought it was there. So the idea is that the Nazis just said, no more meetings for you, and all of these groups go away. They never do that.
Yeah.
Okay. The whole idea, remember we saw that with the Illuminati. Bavarian government had to do it 4 times before the Illuminati just moved to France. Trying to outlaw secret organizations never works. They either just change their name or they just go more deeply underground. So, the Freemasons continued on in Germany. Other groups did as well. They just shut up about it. The Brotherhood of Saturn continued to function. So here's the most intriguing thing. Maybe this is a good place to sort of wrap things up. What's the most intriguing possibility that's been said about the Freemasonic Order of the Golden Centurion? Well, that the Nazis took it over.
Go on.
That they replaced its membership with their own. That the Nazi elite assumed the 99 positions. And they made their pact with whom? The spirit of war. Barzabel.
Wotan.
This is kind of similar to Wotan. Okay.
Yeah, I was about to
Wotan,
say.
Are we talking about... Remember, these things can just take whatever they... What do you want to call me today?
Yeah.
Wotan, Barzabel, Asmodeus.
Well, you can't know the name, right? Because it's the power.
Okay, it's actually Rumpelstiltskin. But... so... And so this is the Nazis took it over, and the first big blood purge was in 1934, and this is what the whole killings of Röhm and the other sort of dissident Nazis were about. They were all being offered sacrifices to Barzabel, and Barzabel said, okay, we got it. Let's go to war.
Yeah.
Let's do all of this stuff. And then the Faustian bargain played out. And the last sacrifice, the argument is, the last sacrifice to Barzabel was on Walpurgis Nacht, 1945, April 30th. The great holiday of the German witches, when Adolf Hitler killed himself or was killed. The last sacrifice of the Freemasonic Order of the Golden Centurion, or just a good bullshit story, one of the two. But of course, that wouldn't end it either. Who took it over after that? So there, secret societies of the elite, from the maybe happily harmless pseudo-pagans in the woods outside San Francisco, hippies before their time, to the Götterdämmerung of 1945 Berlin and the last sacrifice of the Golden Centurion. They run the gamut.